Tractate Eruvin is largely an entire tractate dedicated to one topic by the laws of Shabbos, which is an expansion on the laws forbidding carrying objects in between domains. It further qualifies prohibitions on certain variations of private property, and what the laws are in areas like alleyways, cul-de-sacs, and similar, and also the laws of the Eruv, which is a makeshift border around a large enclosure to classify it as an area that is permissible to carry in. The first chapter largely discusses the laws of a Mavoi, which is essentially an alleyway, generally branching into courtyards containing houses. At its entrance to the public property, it needs some sort of a beam or a post or a doorway to create a valid entranceway, so it could be designated for this purpose. So, the first Mishnah begins. If, at the entrance to the Mavoi-Alley, there's a crossbeam over it as the entranceway, it must be lower than 20 cubits off the ground. Rabbi Yehuda says it's fine if it's over 20 cubits. If the entranceway is wider than 10 cubits, you must decrease it so it's smaller, unless the entrance has a door frame, which is 2 posts and a crossbeam, in which case it can be wider than 10 cubits. The Gemara says that it explains how to rectify it when it's over 20 cubits, unlike by the discussion on a sukkah, as that's a biblical law, while this is rabbinic. Alternatively, it's actually allowed to rectify both. It's just that by a sukkah, where we don't give an explanation as to how to rectify it, those laws are just a lot more complicated, so they just said it's not allowed and left it at that. The dispute between the opinions here, one which says that it can't be over 20 cubits and the other one which says that it can, is based on whether we're learning this from the entranceway of the sanctuary of the tabernacle, which was 20 cubits high, or from the antechamber, which was a lot higher. The sources are explained, of which there are variants, and the exact wording is argued on a bit. We try to ask why we don't learn it from some other source, but they're disproven. The logic is questioned based on the measurement of the structures, and which ones are referenced as a proper entranceway. We also say we need this very similar law, according to an opinion that they're the same, established both by the laws of sukkahs and this mavoi beam, as a sukkah is dwelled in, and the top is looked at, versus this, which nobody's really inspecting the height of the beam, so it's necessary for this opinion to repeat this opinion, allowing both when they're over 20 cubits. There are similar points discussed. It also brings up the case of what if the crossbeam is partially within 20 cubits and partially above, and what about by the top of the sukkah? One opinion rules that it's permissible by a mavoi and not allowed by a sukkah. We try to bring some explanations to this logic, and we say it's because a sukkah is used by a private individual, so if the top shifts so that way it's no longer permissible, he probably won't notice, versus by a mavoi, which is public use, so people will notice its condition. Some say it's not allowed by a sukkah, which is a biblical law, but allowed by a mavoi, which is only rabbinic. Some teach this entire argument in the exact inverse. A sukkah would be allowed, as it's for individual use, so you're mindful and responsible of it, versus a mavoi, which would not be allowed in this situation, as it's public use, so everybody would just expect somebody else to take care of its condition. And the other point was that a sukkah is biblical, so people would actually be more careful by it, versus a mavoi, which is only rabbinic, so it needs safeguards to disallow it in this situation. Some just allow neither, some allow both. They both bring respective proofs. Now, all this while, we've been using the measurement of an amma, a cubit, or an arm's breadth. In modern measurement, it's somewhere between roughly 1.5 feet, possibly more. The point posed here is, how big exactly is a cubit? Is it 5 handbreadths, or is it 6? There's some argument as to which of these two measurements are applied by this conversation, whether it's the longer or the shorter variant. Some say we do use the shorter variant by the laws of a sukkah by certain measurements like its maximum height, and similar, although there is disagreement. There is an opinion that we use the stringent option by the laws of kilayim, forbidden plant mixtures, by measuring the clearing and perimeter of a vineyard. There are a number of opinions brought as to what the distances need to be, but they use the longer version of the measurement. There is disagreement based on disproofs regarding the measurements. Some say that we always use the 6 handbreadth measurement of a cubit, but by the laws of kilayim, you make a loose, larger fist, as it's stricter when larger, and by sukkah and a mavoi, the measurements are made with a clenched fist, so they're a bit smaller, as these are stricter when they're smaller. We try to bring some proofs and disproofs for these two opinions. Some say, in regards to the laws of kilayim, that they should be measured with 6 handbreadths, which implies that sukkah and mavoi should be measured with 5, like the first opinion, but perhaps not. Perhaps he intended to exclude the cubit measurements by the temple altar, some of which use the 5-cubit variation. Some say the laws of measurement, standards, interposition, and a mikvah, and partitions are tradition passed down from Mount Sinai. We try to bring a biblical source for the laws of measures being referenced in the 7 fruits of Israel, which each reference a form of measurement, which was a concept mentioned back in Tractate Brachos, but we say no, the laws are orally passed traditions with biblical verses as source. We also try to bring a biblical source for the laws of interpositions, so we say that the oral tradition was to teach that interpositions in your hair, like knots or similar, can invalidate an immersion, but actually no, we bring a biblical source for that too. So rather, the oral law is that an interposition that covers a majority of your hair, but you're fine with it being there, still counts as an interposition. We're fine in that situation with an interposition by a minor part of your hair, by the way. We have the same question again, bringing an apparent biblical source for the law of partitions. So we say that we needed an oral teaching, maybe to show that the tabernacle structure used cubit units of 6 handbreadths, while the tabernacle vessels used cubit units of 5 handbreadths, according to the opinion that holds that everything in the tabernacle used the standard cubit unit of 6 handbreadths. The oral tradition was to teach a few miscellaneous laws, that you can extend a wall up or down, the law of lavud, which allows us to view small gaps in a wall as closed, and the law of a bent wall of a sukkah, where a portion of the wall extends upwards to be part of the roof. Okay, back to the crossbeam over a mavoi. If it's too high, you can pile earth on the ground to make it less than a 20 cubit gap. Some say its width of the dirt pile must be a handbreadth. Some say 4 handbreadths. We offer some suggestions as to the basis of this dispute, and it's either that the first opinion requires the crossbeam as a reminder, so that's where the public domain ends, so you just need a handbreadth of ground raised, versus the other opinion, who requires 4 handbreadths, as he holds it's to serve as an actual partition. Alternatively, you could just say that they both hold it's required as a reminder, but they're arguing over if the dimensions of the reminder by the ground needs to be bigger or the same size as the beam above. Or, alternatively, they agree that it could just be the same size as the beam, it's just that one requires it to be bigger out of concern that the ground will erode. Okay, same concern but the inverse. What if the crossbeam is too low, being under 10 handbreadths? You'd need to excavate dirt underneath to make the gap over 10 handbreadths. But some say it needs to be 4 handbreadths wide, while others say it must be 4 cubits wide. Again, they both give logics, and they both rule in accordance with the other opinions of raising the mound. We discussed the comparison to a case of a mavoi with a breached wall right beside the entranceway, in which opinions agree or disagree with that based on where the board is and how large the breach is. It similarly discusses some measurements of a side post. There's more on this topic. There's further points on cases of the location of the breach. If it's on the front, it can be up to 4 handbreadths. If it's on the side, it can be up to 10 cubits. As it's not viewed as a gap, it's just viewed as another entrance. If the corner itself is included in the breach, as long as the breach is over 4 handbreadths, it would actually invalidate this enclosure, as it's not viewed as an entrance here, as people don't put entrances in the corners of their walls, usually. Others disagree on this point. It discusses some other variation, what if there are ridges in the breach, how that makes variance, and similar. It also brings up turning a street into a manner permissible to be carried in. If there's houses on either side, you make a door frame on one end and a crossbeam or post on the other. Others say it's a debate. One says you put a door on either end and you have to have the doors closed when traveling through, while another opinion says you can put a door on one side and a post or crossbeam on the other. This is argued further. It says that the city of Jerusalem and Mechozah have doors which are shut, so that way you're not liable for carrying inside. So, rather, some say it means you need a door frame on one end, while others say that it needs a proper door, and there are some opinions who rule like this. Some say you don't need to close the door. We try to bring a proof to the gates of the city of Nehardia, which were sunk into the sand and stuck open, but we can't as they are partially closed actually. One sage said that they should clear the sand, but that may have been only to make the doors fit to be closed. This and further points on doors are questioned. Who we follow gets into an argument about following contradicting stringencies, such as by an argument regarding an incomplete skeleton, if it has laws of impurity, the argument being how many vertebrae can be missing, and what the damage to the skull needs to be, and similar points on tithes. There's further debate on the case. Some say it's where the mavoi opens into a public domain on one end, and an open field onto the other. You just need a door frame and a post. Some say if one end opens into a public domain and the other end opens into a back lot, you only need one post by the front. We try to bring comparison to a case of a mavoi that opens into a courtyard, that the far end of the courtyard opposite the mavoi is breached. It says you can carry in the courtyard but not in the mavoi. Some say it varies in this case if there was an Eruv boundary made over the mavoi and courtyard together. We also argue what can separate the courtyard and the mavoi, arguing on a post that's visible from the outside but flush on the inside, and if the courtyard ends in the middle or at the side of the back lot. This is argued on further, and we have a few opinions who hold differently on the topic. Some qualify this saying it's allowed if the back lot breach is not directly across from the mavoi, and it's only forbidden to carry in the mavoi if it's directly across. Some even add the qualification that you can only carry in a mavoi opposite a breached wall that's not perfectly aligned if the lot is owned by many people. As if it's owned by one person, it's possible, occasionally this happens, that people will build houses in their back lot, which would then make your mavoi essentially a mavoi which ends at the side of a back lot, which you can't carry within. We try to bring the source by a case of a mavoi where one side is a sea and the other side is a trash heap, but that doesn't have a ruling, as on one hand, those are valid partitions, but on the other hand, the trash heap could be removed and the sea might bring up sediment, which would make the sea no longer steep enough to be a wall. Anyways, point is of bringing this case was that the concern by the trash heap was it was by a private owner who could remove it at any time. So based on this, we see there is a difference by a mavoi owned by many or by a single individual. By the trash and sea case, we rule that you can't carry there. One sage put up extra nets by a city as partitions as they were using the sea, which he was concerned about bringing up sediment. There are other cases discussed. We also say that a small courtyard that was breached into a large one, you can carry in the large, but not the small, as it's like an entrance to the large courtyard. There are other such cases brought up. It also brings up a mavoi with many branching off mavois. Some say it needs posts at their ends, but where the mavois meet each other, you need a doorway, so it fits like the other opinions. It also discusses a mavoi whose walls are slightly disaligned. If the gap is less than 4 cubits, you can put a crossbeam diagonally across the edges. If it's longer, it starts at the shorter wall. Others say you always need to put the beam across the shorter wall, and the diagonal beam won't serve as a reminder, which he holds is its function. The one who allows it, he holds that it serves as a partition, which it does if diagonal. Some limit the diagonal beam to being 10 cubits or shorter, and if longer, you have to place it across the short end. Also, the argument if the beam is as a partition or a reminder would also cause an argument if you can carry directly beneath the beam. Alternatively, it could be that there is an argument even if they agree that the beam is to serve as a reminder, as it's about whether it's a reminder for the outside or the inside. Or they could agree that it's to serve as a partition, and they argue if the outer or inner edge creates the partition. There's also an argument if you stick 2 pegs on the outside of the walls and put the beam on those, whether that's a valid cross beam for a mavoi. Some say it depends on if you hold you can carry under a beam. Some say it's not allowed at all, as the beam needs to be on top of the mavoi. If there's a crossbeam suspended on a vertical beam in front of a mavoi, some say it's allowed to be less than 3 cubits away from the mavoi walls. Some say 4. So that seemingly contradicts the prior point, so we say no, that's not what that case refers to. Actually what it means is either where the beam is only over one wall, or in between the 2 walls over 2 pegs, and it's allowed due to some leniencies. There's further argument on carrying beneath a crossbeam, and also whether you can carry opposite a post, which is also argued based on sources. Some say the argument is where there's a series of posts lined up with less than 4 cubit spaces, based on whether you hold this applies to gaps less than 3 or 4 spaces, and their respective logics, whether they're included in one region or not. This is argued on further with different qualifications. We try to suggest a case of just one post that's visible, but flush with the wall of the mavoi, but it's held that that isn't valid. It's actually argued on, and some hold a post that's visible from the inside and flush with the outside is a valid post. We're trying to figure out who holds which. We also try to bring the case of a mavoi wall that's indented. If it results in a post flush on the outside and visible on the inside, or vice versa, it's valid. We conclude that it's a Rabbi Chia that holds a post only visible from the outside is valid, and Rabbi Shimon ben Rebbe says it's not. We argue the cases further. We bring back the case of the 2 courtyards, one bigger than the other, extending into each other. We say if the small courtyard's walls extend into the larger one and forms 3 cubit gaps, those should be valid as posts, maybe? So we say no, it's unevenly slotted in, so one side is 4 cubits wide and the other is 2, so only one side is a post, and this is like the opinion that requires 2 side posts. We discuss the cases further and bring proof that a post visible only from the outside and flush on the inside is a valid post. Others disagree and say that if the post is flush and extends in a line along with the mavoi, if it's less than 4 cubits long, it's valid, and you can carry until the post's inner edge. If it's longer than 4 cubits, it's just considered to be an extension of the wall and cannot be used as a post. Based on this, it would imply that a post visible on the outside and flush on the inside is a valid post, and we say in the end that that's the ruling, that it's a valid post. The next point was on a mavoi wider than 10 cubits, you need to decrease it. The opinions on this are discussed. Some allow sticking a pole between a 20 cubit mavoi to separate it. Others disagree and require sticking a 10 by 4 cubit board in between the length of the mavoi. Some allow, by a 15 cubit wide mavoi, to put a 10 by 3 board along the width, leaving a gap of 2 and 10 cubits. We also discussed why we didn't suggest 2 1.5 boards or 3 1 cubit boards, which would imply that the gaps can't be equal to the size of the walls, but we say that's not why, it's because the middle board gets nullified by the gaps on its sides. Also, the reason we didn't suggest a cubit gap next to the wall and between 2 1.5 boards separated by a cubit is as we didn't want to trouble people to have to make 2 boards. This is discussed further along with comparison to a case of a leather cover on a latrine seat and its measurements and gaps. We also said that a too wide mavoi can be fixed by putting in a door frame, and a too tall mavoi can be fixed with a prominent, noticeable, extended crossbeam. As for the inverse, a door frame is valid for fixing a too high mavoi, but we don't have a proof that a prominent crossbeam fixes a too wide mavoi. Others hold that a door frame is not valid to fix a too wide mavoi. Based on that logic, if there's a courtyard surrounded by walls that have doorways and window frames, those are considered like door frames, and it's invalid to carry within, based on the logic that the gaps in the wall are wider than the wall segments, and it cannot be corrected by a door frame. But we say that's not a good comparison, as the gaps in the walls of a courtyard are a less serious breach than a too wide mavoi, so they're not comparable. We try to bring another proof, but again, that one deals with something unique, which is a defective entranceway, either without side posts or a top, so again, not comparable. We argue further as to which proofs hold that a too wide mavoi is invalid. We also try to bring a comparison to a case of a vine stretched across poles, which is discussed for a bit. In regards to the making of a door frame, it must have the top beam on top of its posts, not on their sides, and it must be strong enough to hold a door, even if it's one made of straw. Some even require it to have a hinge of a sort as a pivot hole. Some require the top beam to be touching the posts, others don't require it. There's a quick story about this. There's also a connected argument if you put a mezuzah on an archway. Some say yes, some say no. There's argument on the dimensions of the size, and the argument is based on whether we hold you can carve to complete the necessary definitions. It's argued further. New Mishnah. If you want to make a mavoi allowed to be carried inside, Beis Shammai requires a beam and a post. Beis Hillel requires a beam or a post. Some require 2 beams. Some say that they actually agree that you can do either or if it's less than 4 cubits wide, and the argument is by a mavoi that's 4 to 10 cubits. Beis Shammai requiring both, and Beis Hillel requiring either. Some say that they argue in both cases. The Gemara says that this argument refers to a closed mavoi, meaning with 3 walls. We say that Beis Shammai requires the 4 walls rabbinically, and Beis Hillel requires 3 walls and a partition rabbinically. When the third opinion says that he required 2 posts, we try to conclude from a source whether he also needs a crossbeam, but we can't. There's further points, and whether we're more lenient by narrower alleys, less than 4 cubits. There's also argument if you need 1 or 2 boards by the entrance to a courtyard to allow it. We also bring a case of a courtyard that ends at the sea that only requires 1 board, but that's because there's leniencies by a body of water. There are more discussions on this topic. It also gets into a sea that breaches the middle of a courtyard, and we say that if the gap is 10 cubits or less, then you can draw water from it, but if more, then not. In this case, you can still carry in the courtyard, as the case is where there's still the bottom half of the wall 10 cubits high beneath the water. Some say that a mavoi with a beam, you can't throw things into it, but with a post you can. This is discussed further, whether you can make a shittuf, which is where you merge courtyards by everybody contributing some bread that's then placed into a common location in one of the courtyards to designate people to be allowed to carry between them. So it's argued if that makes a difference and how. The argument by the post and beam is that this opinion says that a post is a partition and a beam is a reminder, but others say both are reminders. These points are argued on further, along with an attempted comparison to a case of 2 houses on opposite sides of a public property. You can either put 2 posts on either end of one of the houses or 2 beams, and that makes it a private property in between. Others say we can't. The reason that person allowed it, however, was because he held that that was sufficient to make the area a biblical private property. These points are argued on further, along with more discussion on specific distances. It also talks about some sages who learned underneath others and would write scrolls with ink of a specific sort with great precision. This is discussed further, along with some points on the Saita ceremony. This also discusses some laws of ritual impurity. It also says that for 3 years, the 2 big schools, Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, debated each other on laws, until eventually a a voice came down from heaven which said that both of the reviews are the words of God, but we in practice follow Beis Hillel. The reason is explained that in Beis Hillel, they would study also Beis Shammai's laws, and in fact, say them first, and were very humble. We can learn from this that somebody who lowers themselves, God raises, and somebody who raises themselves up, God lowers. Whoever searches for prominence, prominence flees from him, and whoever flees from prominence, it chases after him. The same applies by similar concepts. It expounds more on points between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. New Mishnah. The width of the crossbeam must be at least a handbreadth, as it needs to be able to hold a half brick, at least widthwise, and a brick is 3 handbreadths. Some also require it to be strong enough to hold the half brick, others don't, meaning it could be made of straw, or it could be bent or round. Also, if a round object has a circumference of 3 handbreadths, it has the width of a cubit. Technically, the beam needs a handbreadth and a half, but we can cement underneath the brick to fill it in. There's an argument if the supports of the beam also need to be strong enough to hold the brick. Also, if you drape a mat over the beam that doesn't extend to 3 handbreadths to the ground, it's no longer valid as it's covered, so it can't serve as a reminder, and it's not a good partition as kid goats can pass underneath the gap. It also discussed the validity of several unusual variants of the crossbeam, such as 2 narrow beams that can hold a brick across them, and what level we view it if one thin beam is higher and one is lower. Also, some hold that if it's over 4 handbreadths wide, it's valid even if it's not strong enough to hold a half brick. The remaining points are expanded on and what they teach us. It also gets into a discussion on the mikveh pools made by King Solomon and their sizes and measurements. New Mishnah. The posts. Their height must be 10 handbreadths, and some say their width and thickness can be any amount. Some say the width must be 3 handbreadths. The Gemara says that it's talking about posts in general, not like either opinion. Any amount means even as thin as a string. There are some other cases discussed, and we mention an opinion that if the post is 3 handbreadths off the ground or to the side of a wall, it's invalid. It's further discussed along with a point on making brine on Shabbos, whose opinion we follow, but one sage said that we rule like the accepted practice, which everybody does, which is to use posts of any width. If a post was in the proper place of a mavoi, but it wasn't placed there for that purpose, it's not valid. But there's an argument if it's valid if you intended that it should be a mavoi post before Shabbos started, the argument being whether its initial construction required the proper intent or if this is sufficient. The same argument exists by a partition and similar points by a sukkah, and we try to bring a number of proofs for this argument. We bring a number of them, but in the end we show that it's valid to designate it as a mavoi post right before Shabbos. New Mishnah. You can make a post out of anything, and there's an argument if you can use a live animal. Also, a living thing transmits impurity the same way a tomb cover does. Others disagree. There's also an argument if you can write a bill of divorce on a living thing. The Gemara says that the opinion that you can't write a divorce document on a living thing is based on the verse which specifies on a parchment document. This is argued on further along with other opinions. New Mishnah. If a caravan camped in an open field and they surrounded their encampment with animal accessories like saddles and whatnot, they can carry within on Shabbos if the barrier is 10 handbreadths high and the width of the gaps are less than the solid parts. If there's a large gap that's 10 cubits wide or less, it's fine. It's just regarded as the entrance. If it's more, it's not allowed. The Gemara has a disagreement over if the gaps in the wall are equal in size to their solid parts. There's further argument along with if you enlarge the gaps and by a sukkah. These points and similar are all discussed at length. This and points on gaps go on for a bit. New Mishnah. By this caravan, they can also surround it with 3 ropes if they aren't 3 cubits apart, and the rope's combined thickness must be over a handbreadth, so this way this gate is at least technically 10 handbreadths. They can also have a series of vertical poles, as long as they aren't 3 handbreadths apart. Some say this only applies by a caravan, others say it applies by anybody, it just gave caravans as the common example. Some say the partitions require both of these, others say only one. The Gemara tries to bring a proof that the vertical poles, if there's gaps, it's invalidated just like by the horizontal ones, but we can't, and there are a few points on this. There are further points on how much space an individual gets and how many are considered a caravan, it's all argued on. The other points are discussed, and then it says that the difference between the views, if we need both the vertical and horizontal portions or just one, is in a case where it's in an inhabited area. New Mishnah, there are 4 things that are permitted in an army camp. They can carry wood from any place, they don't need to wash their hands before a meal, they can eat demai, which is questionably tithed produce, and they're exempt from making an Eruv boundary. The Gemara specifies which types of wood they can take. It also says that where a soldier is killed, that's where he's buried, as he's considered an unattended corpse, which is buried where it's found, even if he has people who would bury him. This is discussed further The washing that they're exempt from is washing before a meal, not after, as there's sodomite salt that can leave traces on your hands and it could cause blindness if you don't wash it off. Also, you should definitely wash your hands after handling large amounts of salt. We expand the points on eating demai, and the points of an Eruv are in regards to an Eruv Chatzeros, allowing you to carry between private domains, but they must abide by the laws of Eruv Techumen, the 2,000 cubit limit of travel on Shabbos. It also discusses the punishments for violating this, and that's the end of Chapter 1. Chapter 2 of Tractate Eruvin deals with the issue of wells on Shabbos, among some other topics. The interior of a well is usually deep and wide enough that it's considered as a private property, and drawing water to the surface is then taking it to a public property, so that's not allowed. This was very problematic for all the people traveling to Jerusalem by the holiday pilgrimages, so there were leniencies allowed to erect a partition around the well, allowing you to draw water from it. The Mishnah says, to be able to draw water from a well on Shabbos, you need to construct 4 double posts bent at right angles around the corners. Others say you need an additional 4 single posts in between. Their height must be 10 handbreadths, their width must be 6 handbreadths, and they can be any thickness. The gaps between posts may be as wide as 2 teams of 3 oxen, which will be explained to be about 10 cubits. Others say 2 teams of 4 oxen, 3.5 cubits, and it's where the oxen are tied together. And one team is entering and the other is exiting, to be precise in the amounts. You can bring the posts closer together as long as there's space between for a cow's head and most of its body to be in the enclosure entering. You can expand the boards as much as you want as long as you add boards so the gaps are never too wide. Some limit this size to 2 base se'ah, which is 50 by 50 cubits, so double that, which is 100 by 50. Others say that limitation only applies to a garden or similar, and other enclosures can be much bigger. The Gemara says an opinion that doesn't allow this by a water hole, but permits it by a well. We try to bring some other opinions that seemingly disagree, but they are proven to be discussing different situations. It gets into some translation with the Mishnah, and it branches off into a side topic. An opinion states that Adam had a second body attached to his back, Eve, which was later detached. Some say it was actually a tail. Based on these arguments, there are a number of verses argued over. It's largely a repeat of a conversation that was at the end of Tractate Brachos on page 61a. This is discussed further. Repeating some points, it says that the male was in front, as it's very immodest for a man to walk behind a woman, and similar, as it says, Manoah arose and followed his wife, which implies that he was an ignorant man, as he was following his wife being behind her, which is, we said, inappropriate. But others disagree, saying that it says the same thing about Elkanah and Elisha, so it means that they followed her advice, not literally walking behind her. There are other points about not going behind a woman, better to go behind a lion, but it's better to go behind a woman than to go behind an idol, and it's better to go behind an idol than to go behind a synagogue when they're praying and not enter. There are further teachings that Adam fathered spirits, demons, and Liliths after his banishment from the Garden of Eden from involuntary emissions, not from relations, as it says that he fasted and refrained from intimacy and wore fig branches for 130 years after. Another teaching, you can give part of a person's praise in their presence, but all of their praise only when they're not there, so that way you don't look like you're flattering them. It also says that the dove returned to Noah with an olive leaf to demonstrate that it would rather bitter food from God than sweet food from humans. Another teaching, any house that hears words of Torah at night will never be destroyed. It also says that since the destruction of the temple, it's enough for the world to use the 2-letter name of God. It also says that when Babylon was cursed, its neighbors were also cursed, and when Samaria was cursed, its neighbors were blessed. Another teaching, God is different than mortals, that when a king punishes somebody, they block his mouth with a piece of wood so that way he doesn't curse the king. But when God punishes somebody, that person is silent. Then it goes into a point on Gehenna. It says that Jewish sinners repent, but idol worshippers that sin don't repent even at the gates of Gehenna. It also says that the fires of Gehenna don't have complete hold over the Jewish people within, all based on verses. It also says an opinion that Abraham reaches into Gehenna and removes the Jewish people that didn't marry idol worshippers and shamefully cover their circumcision. It also taught that there are 3 entrances to Gehenna, in the desert, in the sea, and in Jerusalem, based on verses. Some say there's another entrance in the valley of Ben Hinnom, where there are 2 palm trees with smoke rising between them, but some say that's just the Jerusalem one that we referenced. It also lists the 7 names of Gehenna: Sheol, Abaddon, Annihilation; Be'er Shachas, Well of Destruction; Bar Sha'on, Pit of Turbulent Waters; Tit Hayavin, the Mire; Tzalmaves, Shadow of Death; and Eretz HaTachtis, the Underworld. It brings all of the sources. Although it's just called Gehenna, which means the Valley of Immorality. It mentions some other potential names, and then says that the entrance to the Garden of Eden is either in Israel, so it's by Beis Sha'an, or it's in Arabia, so it's by Beis Goyrim, and if it's between the rivers, the entrance is at Dumaskanin. It also talks about the fruits of these regions. Back to the original topic, it says the oxen, as measurements, are actually tied together, not just next to each other. It also gives the measurements of the average cow. It then gives the measurements of the amounts we said, which was either 10 or 13.5 cubits. By a well 8 cubits wide, both opinions agree that you need the corner posts, and if it's 12 or more cubits wide, they both agree that you need the middle posts also. The argument is where it's between those amounts. There are a few miscellaneous points on this and some questions and answers on particularly unique cases. One of the questions, for instance, is what if a courtyard extends right up against this well region? Can you cross between your private domain to somebody else's? So we say yes, as that well isn't considered to have residence. If 2 adjacent courtyards open right into the well area, you can't carry within, as then people will think that the board situation is viable to connect 2 courtyards, which it's not. You need a proper connection. Others allow it if there's a proper Eruv on the courtyard. Another question, if the well dries up, can you still use this enclosure? We say no, but allow it if the well refills itself. Others disagree. We also bring a discussion that says that the partitions still function even if traffic passes through them. This gets into another point about drinking over a domain line. We bring a case. What if you have your well and an animal's trough extends into the well domain? So we say that you can pour buckets from the well into the part of the trough that's in the domain and let it flow out to the animal, but you may not carry the bucket over the trough and pour it straight by the animal out of a concern that you might notice an issue with the trough and mistakenly put the bucket down in the public domain and then put it in the trough, which is transferring an item from a public to a private domain, which is not allowed. We give a slightly modified version of this discussion. We also mentioned that camels are unique, that they need to be mostly inside the enclosure, as they have a long neck, and it could reach further into a public domain. This is discussed further. Some say that the well partition can only be used by the pilgrims, some allow its use for other animals too. Some specify that it needs to be good quality water for a person for him to be able to use this. This is discussed further. Some say that this well board leniency only applies in Israel and Babylonia, nowhere else, as those have big schools that students would frequently travel between, among other differences. Others exclude Babylonia from this as it has plenty of water. This is discussed further along with the interpretation of several verses. Some other verses are expounded on. It also talks about the importance of following the teachings of the sages, such as that Rabbi Akiva was incarcerated by the Romans prior to his execution, and a sage brought him water, which he would drink and use to wash his hands, a rabbinic ordinance. A guard came over to him and he said that he had way too much water. Perhaps he was trying to dig his way out, so he only gave him half the water, so Rabbi Akiva only used that for washing his hands. The sages said about this that he must have been comparatively so much greater in his youth, and when he was out of prison. There are more verses expounded on about the teachings and institutions of King Solomon. There are further verses which are defined. We go back to the well and further define the dimensions of the Beis Se'ah area. New Mishnah. If the path of the public property cut through the posts, you have to divert the thoroughfare to the side. Others say you don't have to. Some say that the city of Jerusalem requires its doors on either end to be closed, so it's not a public domain. Others disagree. There are other opinions on this broad. Some say that the entirety of Israel is not a public domain, but this is in reference to the steep slopes of Jerusalem, which are difficult to traverse, so are not considered a public domain. We bring sources. We further discuss what the differences are if the thoroughfare passes over a mound 10 handbreadths tall by 4 cubits. There are some more miscellaneous cases discussed. New Mishnah. You can make this well partition for a public water hole, or a well, or a private well. For a private water hole, it requires 10 handbreadth high boards all around. Others say you can only make the board partition by a public well. Everything else would require an enclosure made of ropes that's 10 handbreadths high. The Gemara says that we follow the opinion that well boards are only allowed by a public well and only for spring water, and we need both of these rules. New Mishnah, an additional statement. Some say that a garden or similar, which is a bit over 70 by 70 cubits, which has a 10 handbreadth fence around it, you can carry inside it, as long as it has a watchman's booth or a dwelling within or is near a city. Others say it's fine if it only contains a water hole, ditch, or cave. Some say that as long as it abides by those measurements, it's fine to carry within without any structure of a sort inside. Some say that if it's longer than it is wide by even a cubit, you can't carry inside. Others say it's fine even if it's twice as long as it is wide. Some say that it can be even as large as a base car, which is about 75,000 square cubits. Some other opinions: if many people join their houses in a shared courtyard with an Eruv and one forgot to, he cannot use the courtyard, but his neighbors that did make the Eruv can go in and out of his house. Another miscellaneous teaching from this sage: you can eat maror on Pesach by eating arkablin, which is a vine that grows around palm trees, but there was nobody to corroborate this opinion. The Gemara asks, why did this Mishnah start by saying additionally? In addition to what? So the sage being quoted in the last Mishnah is being re-quoted here, but we interrupted his last point with a different subject, so we used the word additionally. The difference between two of the opinions that are essentially seemingly the same that we listed is that they disagree over the small amount between a full base sa'ah, which is 5,000 square cubits, and the 70 and a fraction, which is slightly less than 5,000. We learn about the dimensions from some calculations by the construction of the tabernacle. This is discussed along with some opinions on who we hold like. Some other rules: this enclosed area we're speaking of, if it was enclosed for residential use, you can carry in it even if it's larger than 5,000 square cubits. But if majority of it has vegetables planted in it, it's considered to be a garden and then you can't carry inside. But if you planted trees, it's considered like a courtyard and you can carry. Some qualifications: some say that if it's exactly 5,000 square cubits or less, it's fine even with the vegetables. This is argued on for a bit. The point on most being trees being allowed to carry within. Some say that's only if the trees are planted in rows, others disagree. Another point: if the enclosure is larger than the 5,000 cubits and it's not for a residential purpose, but you build a house next to it, how do you designate it as a residential courtyard? So it's suggested to make a breach over 10 cubits wide and then repair part of it so it's now less than 10 cubits, so it's been re-enclosed for residential use, and that makes it permissible. Okay, but what if you break and repair the wall 1 cubit at a time? Is that allowed, or does it have to be all at once? So we bring a proof from a case of a sandal and laws of impurity where it's breaking apart in sections, and we say that it is permissible. Another opinion: if you have a back lot behind your house that's over 5,000 square cubits, a back lot isn't really for residential use, you can't carry all around in it. However, if you made an entrance to it from your house, it's allowed, as long as that was done before the enclosing of the lot. This applies even when there's a granary in the backyard, so the entrance isn't just opened in the first place for the intent of the granary, it was also made for the back lot. Another point: if this enclosure of over 5,000 square cubits for residential use became filled with water, some say that this is like when it's filled with vegetables, which makes it impermissible. Some others say it's when it's like it's filled with trees, which makes it permissible. Some say it varies if the water is fit for use, others say it varies if the water is deep. Others disagree on the deep point, saying it's comparable to a mound of produce, which doesn't create variation due to its height. Another case: a back lot over 5,000 cubits, which one side opened into a mavoi, and the other side opened into a path through some vineyards which led to a river. None of these areas are permissible because they connect to the forbidden lot, as it's too big. So it was suggested that they should put a post by the end of the vineyard path, thus fixing that one, and that by extension should also fix the back lot. Some don't allow this, as the only reason that post works is because the riverbank is acting as a partition, so if you allow this, then people would think that it's always allowed even without the river. A different solution is to put a post by the back lot of the first mavoi, and it'll close the mavoi and the back lot. So you can now carry in the mavoi and in the back lot, but it's an argument if you can carry between the two. The difference is whether you hold people might live in the back lot, which makes it a separate residence than the mavoi, and there's issue with carrying between two adjacent domains if they're owned by different residents. Another situation: if you have a too large back lot, you can't reduce its size by planting trees inside, but you may build a 10x4 handbreadth pillar within to make it small enough that it's allowed. If the width of the pillar is less than 3 handbreadths, it's not valid, as it's deemed insignificant. If it's between 3 and 4 handbreadths wide, it's an argument. Back to a prior case where the lot is next to a house and you want to make an entrance to allow it for residential use. Another option is to create a new wall at the back end of the lot, at least 4 handbreadths away, to re-enclose it and allow carrying. 3 handbreadths is too small, and again there's an argument by between 3 and 4 handbreadths. Another option, you can put mud on the inside of the walls until it's smaller than 5,000 square cubits. If the mud can stand on its own, this works. If it can't stand on its own, it's an argument. If at the back end of the lot there's a mound, you can build a partition 4 handbreadths away to make it permissible to carry within. There's an argument if it's less than 3 handbreadths away, or it's on the upper edge of the mound, based on whether you're allowed to build a partition on top of a partition. We cite many cases to figure out who's right, but the result seems to be that it's not allowed to do that. Another case, if you have a lot far over the size of 5,000 cubits, which is 2 beis sa'ah, here the lot is the size of 3 beis sa'ah, and you cover a third of it. Some say that it doesn't create a separation, so you can't carry anywhere within. Others say that it divides the lot into 2 sections where neither of them exceed 5,000 square cubits, so you can now carry anywhere within. The logics are explained. Some say the variation is where we're dealing with a slanted roof. Some rule that if a 5,000 square cubit lot is breached entirely into a courtyard, you can't carry within, as the spaces combine to be over the limit and the walls aren't acting as a partition. Another case, an orchard in somebody's backyard, the wall of the house acts as one of the walls, but if the wall collapses, now the inside wall of the house can act as the wall, so you can still carry within. However, others disagree, as the inner wall was made for the inside of the house, not for the outside. Another case, there was an arbor, an enclosed little orchard in the backyard of a sage. So in order to be able to carry there, they erected a fence of sticks on either side of the path, each less than 3 handbreadths apart. Others disagreed and said it was fine without the sticks, but others said that building an orchard or even a house in a lot afterwards doesn't reclassify it as permissible, so actually you should have had the sticks there. We bring sources and proofs. We said in the Mishnah that some hold it's permitted if the lot is as large as a base car. We bring a source for the argument, and it also expounds on a verse that when Chizkiah became ill, Yeshayahu established a yeshiva for students to learn Torah next door and their merit to protect him. Some say we should always do this for a sick person, and others say no, as it could incite Satan, the angel of death, against you. The remaining cases are discussed and argued over, along with the definition as to what the vines we mentioned were. And that's the end of Chapter 2. Chapter 3 of Tractate Eruvin discusses the laws of the Techum and the Eruv, so some background first. A Techum means boundary, and it's the law that you may not go further than 2,000 cubits from your place of dwelling on Shabbos. That's the rule. What you can do, if you need to travel further than that, is to shift the definition of your place of residence by creating an Eruv Techumin, which will redefine, temporarily, your place of residence. It would need to include both where you're staying and where you're going to within its boundaries. You can establish an Eruv Techumin by either staying in that middle location until Shabbos starts, or by leaving an amount of food there prior to Shabbos' start. Both of these symbolically make that location your new place of residence, and you can now travel between your shifted boundaries. The first Mishnah states, you may make an Eruv Techumin, or a Shetufei Mavoi, which is another concept for later, using all types of food, besides for water and salt. The foods can be purchased using Ma'aser Sheni tithe funds. Also, in general, a person who vowed to abstain from eating nourishing foods is still allowed to eat water and salt. You can use wine to make this Eruv for a Nazir who has taken an oath against wine, or for a Yisrael with Teruma, which he can't eat. Others say you can't use Teruma food. You can put the Eruv for a Kohen in a plowed-over courtyard, which a Kohen can't normally enter. Some say you can even put it between graves, because the Kohen can technically make a partition between the graves and eat his Teruma. The Gemara says that based on a specific phrasing from the Mishnah, it references the fact that women are exempt from all positive time-bound mitzvahs, as learnt later in Tractate Kedushin. This is a general rule. However, in spite of that status, there are exceptions. This applies even if the general rule says except, listing specific exceptions. You can't assume that no other exceptions exist. This rule applies also by some laws of impurity, and also here, where we said you can make an Eruv out of any food besides for water and salt. Unsaid, however, but also still not allowed, are using truffles or mushrooms. Some say water and salt combined can be used for an Eruv. Some say that water and salt combined can be purchased with Ma'aser funds, and definitely also used for an Eruv, but not vice versa. This was argued on elsewhere. It also discusses purchasing water and salt with Ma'aser money included with oil. We bring many sources and they're argued over. There's also a source which says you can purchase fish with Ma'aser funds, and that source is also argued over. We bring the source that fish aren't considered nourishment from the ground, and there's a disagreement by birds. Okay, some other foods you can make an Eruv with. A specific type of herb called papuin, purslane, and coriander, but it says that you can't use green unripe grain or unripe dates, which aren't usually eaten. Some say coriander is only allowed if it's not fully ripened and it's unhardened, and only if you have many children who can eat coriander. Some say you don't actually need to have the children. Some allow only median coriander. One sage, Rav, began allowing green grain after he came to Babylonia and saw people eating it, but specifically in reference to the garden variety. It also discusses the proper blessings for these based on how they grow, which we say is the vegetable blessing, Borei Peri Ha'adama. We also discussed whether you can use unripe dates. We said no, but maybe that doesn't include some specific species. We say that they actually can be counted as food in regards to the laws of impurity, as you can technically cook them, but not by an Eruv, which requires immediately edible food. This and a number of other specific vegetables are discussed. Some say you can use a handful of moist beans, some say you can use raw beets, and we discussed their health benefits. It also discusses the amount of apples necessary. Some say it's a kav, which is an old form of measurement, somewhere between 1.5 and 2.6 quarts. Other fruits require less. There are other specific foods discussed onwards, like different parts of an onion. The amounts of beer are discussed. Some say it's 2/4 of a kav, based on sources. Some say an amount smaller than 2 lugin, which is a different form of measurement. For dates, it's discussed. Some say a kav, some say more. A few other specific food measurements are listed. It also says an opinion that something eaten with bread, you can use it if there's enough to eat it with bread for 2 meals, and something not eaten with bread, you can use it if there's enough to eat 2 meals with it. There's a discussion what types of meat qualifies as which of these. There are other discussions. Some say you can use raw meat. One said you can use raw eggs. Some say with 1 egg, some say with 2. There's also discussion on which types of foods are considered to provide sustenance. There's debate on these subjects. We said we can make an Eruv with wine even for a Nazir and with Teruma for a Yisrael, and others disagree. They would say you could make an Eruv on the eve of Yom Kippur, even though you can't eat, as that was edible while it was still day, unlike by the wine and Teruma, which can't be eaten at all. Some said it's not even enough to put food there, you also have to have your bed and utensils there. Some say you have to wear the same type of clothing, the same color, when you carry on Shabbos as the clothes you wore when you made the Eruv. And some require you to put your clothes you plan on wearing at the location you made the Eruv. Some require the Eruv to be made with non-sacred food, but allow the wine for a Nazir, as he could technically annul his vow, unlike by consecrated food. Possibly because it becomes tevel, which can't be eaten by anybody. But we say it's because he holds like the opinion that anything prohibited on Shabbos by a rabbinical law is forbidden during twilight, right as Shabbos starts, and that's when the Eruv takes effect and activates. So this wouldn't work with Teruma. We bring sources. A source says that for the sick and elderly, you can use a smaller amount of food, but for a gluttonous individual, you can use the normal amount of food, as that's an abnormality that would result in astringency. We said you could make the Eruv in a plowed over graveyard for a Kohen, which he can't enter, as he technically could actually enter, as he could blow the dirt away to see if there's any concealed bone fragments. Some allow a Kohen to walk in such a graveyard if many people have trampled through it, as that would remove the bone fragments. We said that there's an opinion that we can put the Eruv in a cemetery for a Kohen, as he can technically create a partition. The types of partitions are discussed, such as going in an enclosed carriage or similar. This also refers to food that cannot become impure if placed on a grave. The Kohen can, in theory, eat this food while avoiding the graveyard from his enclosure by grabbing it with a flat wooden utensil which is non-susceptible to impurity, and the whole exact method is discussed. Some disallow all of this as the gravesite is rendering a personal non-mitzvah related benefit, and people require it to be made to facilitate the performance of a mitzvah. New Mishnah. You can make an Eruv using demai, which is questionably tithed produce, with ma'aser rishon that's had truma taken from it, or ma'aser sheni, tithes, or consecrated produce that was redeemed. Even Kohanim can make an Eruv with challah. You cannot make an Eruv with tevel, which is untithed produce, or ma'aser rishon without teruma taken, and not with ma'aser sheni or consecrated produce that were not redeemed. The Gemara says that demai is allowed, as if he wants he can theoretically renounce all of his property and become a pauper, and then he'll be allowed to eat questionably tithed produce, which can be eaten by poor people. Some say that they can't, but we hold that they can. The qualifications of these different types of tithing are discussed, and their sources. New Mishnah. The Eruv needs to be placed down with the proper intents, but it can be done by an agent. It can't be done by an agent who won't have proper intents. So you can't give your Eruv to be set up by a deaf-mute, a deranged person, or a minor, or somebody who doesn't follow the laws of the Eruv. It is permitted if they're going to be giving it to a qualified individual who will set up the Eruv. The Gemara asks that some allow a minor, but we say that's only by an Eruv Chatzeres, which is different than what we're discussing, which is an Eruv Techumin. The latter case of handing off the Eruv works because we hold elsewhere that there's a presumption that an agent performs his task. We bring sources. This, and further points on tithing, are discussed further. After some further points on this, there's a new Mishnah. If you put the Eruv on a tree over 10 handbreadths from the ground, it's not a valid Eruv. If it's below 10 handbreadths, it works. If you put it in a pit, no matter how deep, it works, as it's accessible. The Gemara says that the case is where the tree is in a public domain, and you intended your residence to be established on the ground beneath. So if it's under 10 handbreadths, it's allowed, as this holds like the opinion that something forbidden rabbinically is not forbidden during twilight. We bring proofs, and some say this only applies to a tree outside the outskirts of a city, but if it's within the outskirts of a city, it's allowed even if it's over 10 handbreadths, as the entire city is considered a private domain above 10 handbreadths, and the tree would be included. Some even allow it outside the outskirts of a city, as this opinion holds that establishing an Eruv also creates a 4-cubit private boundary around it, which extends infinitely upwards. We give some definitions as to what above or below 10 handbreadths means, and this is discussed further. There are further discussions on similar points. We try to bring some proofs from similar cases by a closet and its accessibility. The case of the pit we're discussing is where it's in a Carmelist neutral area, and he wants to establish his residence above the pit. So it's rabbinically prohibited, but it works, as this is the opinion that holds that something rabbinically prohibited is not prohibited by twilight, which would allow this Eruv to function. New Mishnah: if the Eruv was placed on top of a reed or a pole, as long as the reed was uprooted and then stuck in the ground, it works, even if it's 100 cubits high. The Gemara says that the opinion that doesn't allow a non-uprooted reed is like the opinion that says a rabbinically prohibited action is not allowed at twilight, so you wouldn't be able to remove the reed. There is differentiation with the types of reeds used, such as no using hard ones, as they're considered to be like trees, and similar points. New Mishnah: if you put the Eruv in a locked closet and lost the key, it's a valid Eruv. Rabbi Eliezer says that if he does not know that the key is in its place, it's not a valid Eruv. The Gemara explains that the case is where it's a closet made out of bricks that can be disassembled as they weren't cemented together. There are further qualifications. Some say it's made out of wood and it's a utensil, so it can be demolished on Shabbos, and others hold it's the structure. So there are many similar points. These and their correlations to laws of impurity are discussed. New Mishnah: if the Eruv rolled beyond the Techum, or rubble fell on it, or it burned, or it was truma which became impure, it's no longer a valid Eruv. If this occurred after dark and Shabbos had already started, it's fine. Others say that the Techum's center shifts in between his current location and the Eruv. Some people say that a doubtful Eruv is valid. The Gemara says an opinion that if the Eruv rolled beyond the Techum but stays within 4 cubits of the border, it's valid. The case with the rubble falling, you could make it work like every opinion by saying that the rubble here needs to be removed with a hoe and pick, which is biblically prohibited. We need both of these cases to show that it's invalid even if it's near you, and even if you think that a wind can blow it back in. We need to teach that it's invalid if it burned before nightfall, and if it was teruma that became impure, to inform you of lenient and stringent opinions on this. Those stringent opinions are discussed, ruling strictly by a doubtful Eruv, as this opinion holds that these laws are biblical. This is discussed. The opinions are spoken about further, along with the lenient opinion, who holds that it's a rabbinical precept, and what they rule by some laws of purity. There are similar cases. It brings up a case: what if somebody vows that their loaf of bread should be unconsecrated on Friday and consecrated on Shabbos, and then uses it as an Eruv? People rule it to be a valid Eruv. If he did the inverse, vowing his loaf to be consecrated, and then on Shabbos it should be unconsecrated, and then uses it as an Eruv, it's not valid. The reason is because it's a doubt during twilight, so it goes according to its current status, disallowing it if it was forbidden prior to twilight. There are similar cases brought. New Mishnah: discussing making a conditional Eruv. Let's say somebody wants to avoid somebody on Shabbos. The example is brought of a tax collector. So you're allowed to establish 2 Eruvs, one to the east and one to the west, and say that your Eruv is the one in whichever direction you need to go if the tax collectors come from the other direction. You can make it conditional that you can pick which one to use if they come from both directions, or that neither will activate if they don't come at all. Or if there's a big scholar coming to town, you can say that your east Eruv works if he's in the east, or west if he's in the west. If 2 scholars come from either direction, you can activate either one. If neither come, then neither activate. A different sage adds that if 2 scholars visit, you should visit the one that's your teacher, and if they're both your teachers, then you should visit whichever one you want. There are similar cases mentioned in the Gemara of a town official you want to meet, of different kinds of scholars, and similar. These are all discussed. It goes on about this and some points on temple sacrifices and their designation for a bit. This and the concept of Berera, choice by temple sacrifices, are discussed. New Mishnah: if a holiday falls out right by a Shabbos, either just before or just after, you can establish 2 Eruvs, with the condition to have either one active on Shabbos and the other one active on the holiday. Others say that the holiday and Shabbos are considered to be one consecutive period, so you can only establish 1 Eruv across the entire period. What he should do, according to that opinion, if you want to maintain an Eruv for 2 days, is to bring your food to that location, wait until Shabbos starts, this activates your Eruv, and then leave with the food. On the second day, you should bring the food back and do the same thing, and then you can eat it if you want, and it works. But if you eat it after the first day, that won't work for the second day. The other sage of the first opinion argued with that logic, saying that that's just saying that it's 2 separate days, which you just said it wasn't. The Gemara discusses these cases along with points on the disagreement. We cite many opinions to try to figure out who's correct. There are more points, such as an opinion that the Eruv food must be fit for consumption the day before, which is argued on a bit. There's further discussion on a number of similar topics. New Mishnah. One opinion says that if, by the holiday of Rosh Hashanah, there is concern that the prior month of Elul will be extended, making Rosh Hashanah 2 days long, you can make 2 Eruvs, a different one for each day. Others disagree, saying it's just one period. The first opinion also holds that they're considered separate days by some laws of tithes, or for instance, the law that if an egg is laid on the first day, it can't be eaten on the holiday it's laid on, but according to this, you could eat it on the second day, as that day is considered separated. Again, the other opinions disagree. One opinion says that on the first day of Rosh Hashanah, you also say a blessing during prayer for Rosh Chodesh, the first day of the month, and you also say it on the second day. Others disagree. The Gemara discusses this disagreement for a bit. The individual cases and some others based on the logics are debated, such as a deer captured on the first day of a holiday by others and eating its meat on the next day. It also says that some allowed using an item that was brought inside the Techum by a non-Jew if it was brought inside for somebody else. This occurred with somebody bringing in turnips to sell, but it was disallowed as then they began bringing in turnips specifically to sell to the Jewish residents, which can't be used on Shabbos. There are similar incidents listed, and the points on prayer are discussed. It discusses if we say the Rosh Chodesh prayer by the additional Musaf prayer on Rosh Hashanah. It's debated. It also discusses if we say the Shehechiyanu blessing, or even on Yom Kippur, and then not drink the wine, because it's a fast day. We say we do it on Rosh Hashanah and on Yom Kippur, and you don't need to drink wine. There are further points on fasting discussed, about fasting on Friday, if you should complete it and fast on Shabbos, which isn't allowed. It's a disagreement. Some allow doing so on minor holidays like Hanukkah and Purim. The different opinions are discussed a bit, but it's ruled that you can complete a fast on Friday. And that's the end of Chapter 3. Chapter 4 of Tractate Eruvin continues the discussions of Chapter 3 of the Techum-Boundary of 2,000 cubits from your residence that you can't leave on Shabbos. The first Mishnah discusses, what if somebody forcibly pulls you out of the Techum, or an evil spirit possesses you, which is an expression that just generally refers to a disorder of your power of perception, and you leave. If you are returned, it's fine, nothing changes. If they put you in a new city or in a corral or similar, some say you can move around in your enclosure, some say you can't move more than 4 cubits. There was an instance when some sages had their Techum established at a port and their ship left on Shabbos while they were on it. Some moved around the whole ship, others stayed within 4 cubits to be safe. There was another incident when some sages were on a ship as Shabbos fell, but they were allowed to disembark from the ship onto the port, as when Shabbos fell, the port was close enough to be within their Techum-Boundary as it was visible from the ship. The Gemara brings a teaching that there are 3 things that cause a person to violate his own will and the will of his creator: people who worship idols, evil spirits, and poverty. We bring this to say that we should pray for mercy due to these. It also says that there are 3 types of people who are spared from Gehenna as they suffer in this world: the poor, people with intestinal disorders, and someone being pursued by creditors. Some add a bad wife, others don't, as they say you could just divorce her. Others say this is a case where you can't do that, where the marriage contract requires a reimbursement that you can't afford, or they have kids and you can't divorce her. This was brought to teach us to accept such tribulations with love of God. In addition, it says that there are 3 types of sufferers who can just die at any time. People who have stomach disorders, you could die due to post-childbirth complication, and hydrokin, which is some sort of a disease. This is necessary to teach us to prepare shrouds for such people. Okay, back to Techum boundaries. Some interpret a teaching from the Mishnah that if you were removed from your Techum against your will and you walk back in, you can't walk more than 4 cubits. And if you leave willingly and somebody else, say a non-Jewish individual, brings you back inside the Techum, you also still can't use it. It also says if you're removed from a Techum and need to use the restroom, you can move around to find a private location because of dignity superseding this whole thing. Some say you can look around to find a restroom and use this opportunity to permissibly re-enter your Techum. Okay, but how do these laws apply to other things? If fruits were removed from the Techum and brought back in, they can be carried around in the Techum because the removal in return is not with their will. Some say that if they were taken out deliberately, they cannot be eaten on Shabbos. This and the different variations of the case are discussed. What if somebody makes his residence in an open field, and then on Shabbos, say, some non-Jewish people build a large partition around the area? He can travel 2,000 cubits within his Techum, And as beyond that is considered to be a private domain, he can throw things past that, as long as it's within the created partition. Some don't allow this out of concern that you'll walk after your thrown object, and they don't allow any carrying within the area at all, as it's like a partition that was breached along its length to your separate Techum domain, which is a separate area, so you can't carry in either. Others agree or disagree. Some allow pulling items, in this case from beyond the Techum into it. Another ruling: if your Techum extends into a half courtyard, you can walk in that half of the courtyard, but no further, and there's no concern of you walking into the other half. Some would allow throwing things into a house without a front wall, that its roof ends right at the edge, as the roof acts as a noticeable marker and as a dividing line between the end of your Techum. We discussed similar cases, such as the earlier mentioned being placed in a corral that you can only move 4 cubits within, as it wasn't established as your residence before Shabbos started, and there's disagreement if you can still throw things out of your area. Some say we follow the opinion that you can move around in such an area, some only allowed in a ship. Everyone allows it on a ship. Some say because you can establish your residence in it before Shabbos. Some say because the ship is constantly moving, so you're constantly being pulled out of your 4-cubit area and having a new one reestablished. There's a practical difference between these two if the walls of the ship were lower than 10 handbreadths, or if you jump from ship to ship. The first opinion wouldn't allow it in those cases, while the second opinion would. The second opinion disagrees with the first, as he holds that the ship's walls exist to keep out water, not to act as an enclosure for the interior. The first opinion disagrees only in a case where the ship is not moving. These points are debated further on the difference between a stationary and moving ship and the different opinions. There is also a debate if the Techum laws apply above 10 handbreadths, which is the limit for several types of domains. This is relevant if you are traveling by jumping above 10 handbreadths or similar cases. Some say not, some say yes. It's debated with many proofs in both directions. One of the proofs is from a case where somebody swears that he will take a Nazarite oath that will be active on the day Mashiach comes. He can't drink wine any day, as Mashiach can come at any day. Besides for on Shabbos and holidays, as there's a tradition that Mashiach will not come on those days. So this implies that Mashiach won't travel over a Techum-Boundary, not even literally over it by 10 handbreadths. So some disagree, saying that Eliyahu the prophet will not arrive to herald Mashiach's arrival the day before these days, but Mashiach could arrive, and it won't disrupt Shabbos or holidays, as when this occurs, everyone in the world will want to help the Jewish people with their Shabbos or holiday preparations. It's debated, but it's an unresolved question. This topic is discussed a bit further. It also brings back the story from the Mishnah with the sages on the ship, and says that the sage could see the port, as he had a hollow tube of a sort that could help you see further. It also mentions some other uses for this measuring device, and how to measure other things by using your shadow and similar. Once there was a sage who accidentally stepped outside the Techum-Boundary, so they allowed him back in by creating a human partition around him. The validity of this action is debated, along with sources and comparison to doing such a thing to create a sukkah. There are some similar cases discussed. New Mishnah. There are exceptions to being able to leave your Techum-Boundary. For instance, you can travel to Jerusalem to testify about the new moon, or to save somebody's life. There was leniency granted for someone like this, that they get a new Techum of 2,000 cubits if they do this. If you traveled out of your Techum for one of these reasons, and then discovered that your services were no longer needed, you still have a new Techum. If you found out before you left your Techum, nothing changes. Also, all those leaving to rescue people may return to their places. That's going to be explained. The Gemara says that if he never left his Techum in this case doesn't reset to where he is. It's still in its original location. Some say that it means that if your new Techum overlaps your old one, you can go back to his original Techum with no changes. The disagreement is over if you hold that overlapping Techum domains combine or not. This is debated. The last statement of the Mishnah, that someone leaving to rescue someone may return to their place, some say this means that they can return to their place with their weapons. This is discussed. Some say there's distinction about returning from a battlefield based on whether you won and there's a remaining danger or not. There are some other miscellaneous laws of warfare on Shabbos mentioned, such as any attack on a border city can be defended as it's considered life-threatening, and we bring proof from verses. New Mishnah. If you're traveling and sit down as Shabbos starts, and only after realize that you are within the Techum-Boundary of the city, some say you can't enter as you didn't intend to designate it before Shabbos, some say you can as you would have. One sage, Rabbi Tarfon, had this happen to him, and he entered the city. The Gemara says the incident by Rabbi Tarfon and says that the disagreeing opinions would say that either he had consciously designated the city as his residence before Shabbos, or the study hall was still within his Techum. New Mishnah. Some say that if you fall asleep on a journey and Shabbos started, you have a Techum of 2,000 cubits from that location. Some say you only have 4 cubits. Some say the 4 cubits have him at the center. Others say you can have the 4 cubit border start wherever you want. Some say that once you choose your 4 cubits in a direction, you can't change it. Some say that if 2 people are restricted to 4 cubit areas and they overlap, they can put food in the middle and eat it. If there were 3 people with 4 cubits, and the middle one overlapped with the other 2, the middle one can bring food and eat with the other 2, and either 2 can eat with the middle one, but the outer 2 can't eat with each other. This is comparable to 3 courtyards that open into each other, and also to a public property. If both the outer ones have an Eruv to connect to the middle one, they can transfer between those, but not between the outer 2. The Gemara says that the opinion that a sleeping person doesn't get a Techum is because he needs conscious intent, and the opinion that says he does get one holds that in general, ownerless objects don't acquire a Shabbos residence, but a sleeping person does, as he also does when he's awake. The point on if ownerless objects require a residence and a fixed Techum is debated. There are proofs brought both ways. It says that we hold like the opinion that allots a sleeping individual a Techum of 2,000 cubits, like those who rule leniently by the laws of Eruvin as their only rabbinic. There's discussion on this topic. There's also discussion on the differences between Eruvs, Eruvei Techumin, and an Eruvei Chatzeros, which can be made without your consent for you, as an Eruvei Chatzeros only benefits you. There are other similar distinctions discussed. We also mentioned the law we follow in the cases of the Mishnah, and sources are discussed. They're debated further, along with a point on the Levirate marriage and remarriage only after 3 months of the ending of her prior marriage to avoid confusion in regards to pregnancy. The points on objects acquiring a Shabbos residence and a Techum are debated further. There's also a source that a non-Jewish person's items don't have a Techum-Boundary on Shabbos, and the resulting cases. Also, if 2 cities' boundaries end at a body of water with a net placed between, some require a proper solid boundary instead of a net to allow drawing that water, as water from the opposite side could have gotten mixed in. This case is discussed, and similar are mentioned, and it's all discussed further. We also discuss if the 4 cubit area that's given to an individual, if it's the standard cubit unit used in the temple, or we measure based on the arm of the person. So if he's tall, he'll have a larger area. We say it's according to the standard measurement, as some people are, say, abnormally small, and then they wouldn't have any space to do anything. In regards to the cases of the overlapping domains by the courtyard, some don't allow transfer between the outer courtyards to the middle one, as there are many people and somebody might mess up. By only 3 people with overlapping domains, then it's very unlikely that they'll mess up as they'll be paying attention, so it's allowed. The reason that all 3 courtyards don't merge is that there's an Eruv only placed in the outer courtyard, or that they were both in the middle courtyard but in different houses. This Eruv courtyard differentiation is discussed further. There are similar cases brought with a courtyard between 2 Mavois and others, and what the opinions hold that you can't enter the Mavois, and some differentiation if they're not accustomed to walk through one of them. There are other points brought, such as if somebody doesn't let others eat his part of the joint Eruv for a courtyard. Some say this disallows the Eruv, some say it doesn't matter, but he's just being stingy. Some say it's not valid if your Eruv portion is in a separate utensil, assuming it wasn't surplus that wouldn't fit. Both of these are necessary, as one has somebody who's being particular with his portion, and the other is where the different portions are physically separate. These are discussed, for instance, in opinion that the owner of the house that the Eruv is placed in doesn't need to contribute food, as everybody is now considered as living in that house, which he actually lives in, and further. The reason an Eruv, which combines courtyards, called an Eruvei Chatzeros, works is everybody purchases the house with a thing of monetary value, here food, and everyone shares joint ownership temporarily, and the courtyard is thereby made accessible to carry within on Shabbos for everybody. We also don't use money in case people forget that you can use food, and if that happens then the practice of Eruv could stop being used and be forgotten. Some say this Eruv works as it symbolically makes the house a place of residence for everybody. The practical difference between those two is if you use a utensil, which can be used to acquire something, but not to create a residence, or if you gave bread that's valued at less than a peruta, which was the smallest coin from those days, so it won't make an acquisition, but it could make you a resident. Or if a minor is used as an agent who cannot legally make an acquisition, but it could make you a resident. We try to bring a disproof for the logics, but we prove they're correct. Also, in regards to the original topic, we hold like the opinion that you can carry from the outer to the middle joint courtyard, and vice versa. New Mishnah. If you're traveling and Shabbos is about to fall, you can designate something to be your Eruv Techumen. Not a large landmark like a tree or a fence, but something specific, like its trunk, for instance. If it's 2,000 cubits away, he can then travel to it, and from there, 2,000 cubits to his house. If he doesn't know a landmark, you can just set his Techum at his location, which will get you 2,000 cubits in each direction. Some say this cubit perimeter is in a 2,000 cubit radius of a circle, some say it's in a square, so you can use the corners too. A poor person or a traveler without food can establish his Eruv with his person and not with food. Some say that's only for a poor person. Some say it's allowed for anybody, and you just use food, so that way you don't need to actually be at the location when Shabbos starts. The Gemara says that by the first case, if you try to make your Eruv by something too large, like a tree or a fence, it says that you've done nothing. Some say this means that you don't have a Techum anywhere at all. Some say that means you have a Techum, but from somewhere beneath the tree. So if you're going north, it'd start measuring from the south side of the tree. Some say the reason for the first opinion, that it establishes nothing, is that your 4-cubit area is not defined. Some say it's because he's trying to establish every 4-cubit square underneath the tree as his domain simultaneously, which is not allowed. A practical difference would be where he said he should acquire a residence in 4 of 8 cubits. The first would say no, and the second, yes, as he's designating a single 4-cubit domain. The points are debated in how the logics would apply by animal tithes and similar principles. In regards to the earlier point about attempting to designate under a tree, but that not working as it's too large, that applies if the tree has 12 cubits beneath it. If less, it's permissible, as it's divided into a bit less than 3 sections of 4 cubits, and the middle 4 is definitely included at least a bit in each area. Some disagree, as used to say we define your residence by the center of the tree, so he'd only allow it by a less than 8-cubit tree, as no matter what, your 4-cubit portion is somewhere included. There are different proofs for each opinion. If you properly designate a tree as your residence, some say this only works if you're able to run and reach the tree before Shabbos starts. There's an incident mentioned which correlates to this. It also brings the biblical source for the notion of a 2,000 cubit limit on Shabbos, which is from a verse, as it says, "Sit each man in his place on Shabbos." That references the 4-cubit personal limit, and then "let no man leave his place," referencing the 2,000 cubit limit of a Techum, 2,000 specifically, as there's a number of other correlations drawn listed here. The source is explained further, along with a point that seems to imply that the Techum is a square, not a circle. The points on a rich or poor person establishing their Eruv on their own person is also discussed. Some say the case is only of the poor person doing so, where he doesn't know of any landmark to set as his Eruv instead, and we bring proofs. This is discussed, along with if you have 4 cubits in addition to your 2,000. We can't bring a proof, but that's what we hold like. New Mishnah. If you have 2 houses that are 4,000 cubits apart, so there's a Techum in between that allows people to travel between the houses, and you start traveling, but say your friend gets you to turn back, you can still travel between the houses if you want, but all the other townspeople cannot. This will be explained. Also, some say that if you're able to put a Eruv Techumen somewhere, and you don't, you just verbally assign it, your Techum is only between that location and your current one. The Gemara explains that the difference between the person who can use the Techum and the townspeople who can't is that you're considered to be like a poor person who is traveling to his house, and you may establish your Eruv with verbal designation. Everybody else cannot. We bring sources and a related incident. When we said that if you verbally designate the Eruv, when you could actually set it, your Eruv is between. That's even where he definitely didn't establish a valid Eruv. New Mishnah. If you willfully exit the Techum, even a cubit past, you cannot re-enter. Some allow it if you're only 2 cubits past, but not 3. The Gemara says an opinion that if even 1 foot is outside the boundary, you can't bring it back in, as the verse says foot, singular. Others disagree. Some say you can, as the word foot there is read in plural. Others say that you can, as it goes by where most of your body is. The opinion that you can go 2 cubits out has a contradicting case, but that's where he's measuring his Techum, where it's precise, even if it ends in the middle of a cave. New Mishnah. If you don't make it to your Techum before Shabbos starts, even if you're a cubit away, you can't enter. Some allow it if you're even 15 cubits away, as they hold that the surveyors who delineate the city's Techum will make it smaller than it actually is. The Gemara explains that it's made smaller to provide a safeguard for people that accidentally wander a bit outside the Techum. And that's the end of Chapter 4. Chapter 5 of Tractate Eruvin continues on the topic of the Techum, the 2,000 cubit square boundary limit around an individual on Shabbos. A city also has its own Techum, extending beyond 2,000 cubits in each direction of its borders. The first Mishnah says, if there are houses protruding over the edge of a city, or a tower sticking out, or ruins that are 10 handbreadths high, extending outwards, or bridges or tomb buildings that have a dwelling place within, the entire boundary of the city's Techum is drawn out to include all of these, and 2,000 cubits from there, and it must be a square, so you will also have the corners, not a circle. The Gemara disputes over the definition of one of the words used. There are other disputes over word translations mentioned. Some say Ma'aras Hamachpelah, the cave where Adam and Eve and the forefathers and foremothers are buried. It's called the double cave, either because it has 2 rooms, others say because it has pairs of couples buried there. Also, the figure of Amraphel is mentioned early in the Torah. This is explained to be Nimrod, and he's called that as it references the fact that he threw Avraham into a furnace. Others say that his name was actually Amraphel, but he was called Nimrod, as the whole world rebelled against God during his reign. Similarly, when it says, a new king arose over Egypt, some say this means a new king, and some say it means the same king, but with new decrees, as it doesn't say that the previous king died. Then, when it says that he did not know Yosef, this is because he either didn't, or it's because he acted as if he didn't. It also talks a bit on how the sages would teach their students in this time, and their greatness. It also talks about the residents of Judea, who were very particular in their speech, so they retained their Torah knowledge, unlike the people of Galilee. Some say it was because they were very precise with their language, and used memory aids. They also learned from one teacher, and they elucidated Talmudic tracts, like King David did. It talks further about this and gives instances of the precise language of Judeans and of imprecise language, where slurred speech makes it sound like you're saying different words. They make a lot more sense in their original language of Aramaic, but it's things like mispronouncing the word master so you accidentally say slave and similar. That's from an incident wherein this woman who couldn't speak very clearly tried to testify before a judge that her tablet had been stolen, but accidentally, because she couldn't talk properly, mistakenly accused the judge of stealing a beam and that he should be hung on it. So clearly you should be very careful with your words. There are further examples of unique usage of languages. Also, the sage Rabbi Yeshua ben Hanania said that there were 3 times he had been beaten in a verbal encounter. Once he ate by an innkeeper, and she made him food, so he ate all of it, and then again on the next day, but on the 3rd day she added too much salt, so he didn't eat any. So she asked if he was making up for all the leftovers he hadn't left the prior days. Another incident, he once took a shortcut through a field and ran into a little girl who asked, "Isn't this a private field?" So he said, "No, it's a trodden path." So the girl said, "Yeah, because thieves like you have turned it into a trodden path." Third incident, he ran into a fork on the road, so he asked the little boy which was the right path to the town. So the boy said one was short and long, and the other was long and short. So he took the short and long one, and it led to the town, but it was an inaccessible part, as there was a garden in the way. So he went back and asked, "You said this was a short path." So the kid said, "Yeah, but I also said it was a long path." So he praised the boy for his wisdom. It also speaks of Beruria, the wife of Rabbi Meir, who was a great Torah scholar. There's more points on the importance of learning Torah. It also says how God is unlike mortals, that mortal medicine can be harmful for other illnesses, but God gave us the Torah, which is only good. There are more points on the importance of learning Torah, especially aloud, and to be humble and agreeable, which helps retain your studies. There are many teachings on this topic. There are also points in the importance of reviewing your study, and there was one sage, Rabbi Preda, who would repeat his lessons 400 times for one student, and one time the student still didn't get it after all that, because he was distracted. So he taught it another 400 times, and then a voice from heaven said he could either live 400 years, or everybody in his generation would merit the world to come. So he picked the latter, and the voice said he should get both. It also talks about the importance of mnemonics to help with your learning, and similar points. Okay, back to the original topic. By a square, or rectangular city, that's measured as it is. If it's circle, then you put up a square and include the corners. If there's protruding houses, you include those in the square. If it was shaped like a bow, or like an L, it's viewed as if it's filled in. By a rectangle, you don't extend it like a square, it's shaped like a rectangle. Also, if there's a city shaped like a diamond, we don't put a square around it, we view it like a square according to its rotation. If there are 2 protruding houses from opposite directions, both are extended. A qualification by the bow and L-shaped city, we make the line from where the ends of the city are less than 4,000 cubits apart. If it's really big, and they only become 4,000 cubits higher up, we measure from there. Elsewhere it says that the gap can only be up to 141 1/3 cubits, but that's where the city is cut completely in two. Well, the lot area discussed in chapter 2, the Karpaf, was a bit over 70 cubits, 70 2/3. So why don't they just slot 2 of those to be established between the cities, and now they're no longer 2 separate towns? So These points are discussed further, and the definition of a ruin, as mentioned, is 3 walls without a roof, and 2 walls with a roof is discussed. There are also several buildings which don't extend to city's domain: a tomb building with 2 of its walls breached, possibly without a roof, a synagogue without a dwelling for its caretaker, an idolatrous temple without a dwelling for their priests, stables, storage houses in fields without a dwelling place, a cistern, ditch, or a cave, a field fence or a dovecot, and a house on a boat. All these cases are expounded on a bit. There are also points about what constitutes a poor living space, places like living in a hut or in a city without vegetables available. It says the importance of eating certain vegetables and not to live in a city with steep roads. It also brings up the diagonal city case and says the measurements are in comparison to the world, so north and south, and gives constellations to be able to measure those, along with other celestial rules with the orbit of the sun and planets and how they coincide with certain months. It also talks about how to calculate the Techum by a circular city by putting a square around it, and then getting 2,000 by 2,000 square tablets, and you put them in each of the corners, and that'll give you the measurements. By a 2,000 cubit diameter city, that'll get you 400 cubits within the city boundaries, and then an additional 800 within the 2,000 to the Techum's corners. It also discusses the unique measurements by the cities given to the Levites in the Torah. This is discussed at length. New Mishnah: Rabbi Meir is of the opinion that prior to measuring the Techum, we give the city the Karpaf lot, which is 70 2/3 wide, to extend it. Some say that this only applies between 2 cities separated by 141 1/3 cubits or less, so the cities combine. This only applies by those distances being by 3 villages. They can all be connected if there's less than 141 1/3 cubits in between. The Gemara says that the verse for adding a karpaf, as the verse says, from the wall of a city and outward. Some say that you can make 2 karpafs to connect cities. Others say only 1, meaning the cities have to be within 70 2/3 cubits. This is argued over. We also define the case of the 3 lined-up cities, how this applies by this opinion. It also says that if the middle city is shifted to the side, it must be within 2,000 cubits for the 141 1/3 measurement to function. Similar cases are discussed. New Mishnah: the measurement must be done with a 50-cubit rope held at your chest so it stays level. If they reach a valley or a fence, they should extend it flatly across and continue measuring from there. If there's a mountain in the way, they should shift it over to the side, measure it where it's level, and then add that amount to the calculation, as long as you don't leave the actual Techum while you're measuring, so people watching don't get the wrong idea. If you cannot go around the mountain, you measure it as if the rope goes through it by doing the measurements in level, elevated segments, like this. The Gemara says that the source for a 50-cubit rope is, as the verse says, the length of the courtyard is 100 cubits and its width is 50 by 50. The extra by 50 teaches us this. Also, a shorter rope will stretch if it's taut, and a longer one will sag in the middle and provide inaccurate measurements. There are further descriptions as to the type of rope that should be used. It further goes through how we described how to measure a mountain, and also says that if there's a too tall wall, you can just estimate its width, as long as traffic doesn't pass over it. Some only required measuring a valley via different levels. If a weighted line dropped down hits the side of the slope, meaning there's a bit of a slope. This is all further qualified along with the points on disjointed leveled mountain measurements that's done with a 4-cubit rope specifically, and is not a method used by certain biblical laws in regards to measuring. New Mishnah: the Techum must be measured by an expert. If one of the corners is found to be shorter than the other, we do the longer one. It repeats this twice. We're also lenient by these laws, and it says we even accept the measurement testimony of a slave. The Gemara says that you can even walk past the shorter measurement as long as it's within the boundaries of the longer measurement. The point that was repeated was to include if 2 people measured and they got different amounts, we go according to the longer one, as long as the difference isn't more than 585 cubits, which is the difference by a 2,000 cubit diagonal as opposed to by the straight measurement. We bring sources, and as we said, we're lenient by all this, as all of these laws are rabbinic. New Mishnah: some points on the concept of the Shitufei Mavois, which is an Eruv made to establish carrying between Mavoi-Alleys and courtyards, or between courtyards. You can also put it over an entire town if it's enclosed properly. By a public town, however, out of concern that people might mess up and forget the laws of carrying on Shabbos, so specifically by a public town, there must be a portion of the town excluded from this domain that you're not allowed to carry within, as a reminder. So, the Mishnah says, if a private town becomes a public town, then the whole town can still be included in one Eruv. But if a public town becomes private, the whole town can't be included in one Eruv unless you set aside an area to be excluded from this the size of a town with 50 inhabitants. Others say it must be the size of 3 courtyards, which each contain 2 dwellings. The Gemara gives definition of private towns that became public as some examples of some specific towns that are listed, and vice versa. There's further discussion on this of main streets, entrances to the street, if a ladder over a wall counts, and similar. The dimensions of all these are discussed along with some very specific instances. We also say that we rule like the opinion that requires 3 courtyards separate with 2 dwellings each. Others say you need 1 courtyard with 1 dwelling. New Mishnah, back to Eruvin Techum. If someone was to the side of his town and asked someone to establish an Eruv for him to the west or east, so he could walk there before Shabbos starts, if the distance from him to his house is less than 2,000 cubits, and the Eruv he asked to be established is more than that, it only is established by his house. If the Eruv is within 2,000 cubits and not his house, his only Eruv is by the established Eruv. If he put his Eruv in the extension of his city, then it's included in the lot around the city, so it doesn't do anything. If it's at all beyond the Techum, his Techum is established further in that direction and less in the opposite. The Gemara discusses the Mishnah's case, saying perhaps the house is between him and the Eruv, or perhaps the house is to his right with the other to the left, or perhaps it's where it's at a diagonal from his location. The other cases are discussed. There are other cases brought up, such as a town by a ravine where the measurement is from the wall, if there is, or from the door of the houses if there isn't a wall, and similar points. New Mishnah. In regards to measurements from a city, some say placing an Eruv starts from the end of the city and extends 2,000 cubits from there, even to part of another city. Some say it's only 2,000 cubits from the actual place of an Eruv. The first opinion agrees with the second only by a cave without residence, but if it does have residence, they hold like their opinion that you can walk through the whole cave and then 2,000 cubits beyond. Generally, in regards to making these measurements, if your 2,000 cubits ends in the middle of a cave, you have to stop right there. The Gemara says that by a desolate city, some say a placed Eruv only extends 2,000 cubits from itself, but if you're actually there, then you get the whole city plus 2,000 cubits. Others say either way you can get the whole city plus the 2,000 cubits. This is like the opinion that the point by a cave having no residence meant that it's not suitable for residence like the city. There are proofs and disproofs brought, but in the end we hold like the first opinion that the whole city is included in your Eruv plus 2,000 cubits extending from that. And that's the end of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of Tractate Eruvin further discusses the laws of the Eruv, the laws of the boundaries and domains on Shabbos, specifically now with the laws of the Mavoi-Alley. Essentially, if your house is in a courtyard that has houses of many other residents within it, you're not allowed to carry from your house to the courtyard. However, if before Shabbos a loaf of bread is collected from each house and put into one house, this symbolically makes it as if all of the residents live in that one dwelling, and everybody has a full ownership of the courtyard, therefore meaning that you and everybody else can carry from their house to the courtyard. The first Mishnah states, if one of the houses in the courtyard is owned by somebody who worships idols, or just somebody who doesn't hold with the laws of an Eruv, you can't make an Eruvei Chatzeres. Others say it still is permissible, it's only a Jewish person that can cause issues with invalidating an Eruv by not participating. There's an incident mentioned where a Sadducee heretic was a part of an Eruv and caused issues for the sages. The Gemara questions the logic by not allowing an idol worshipper by this, and it says that it's whether you hold that by these laws of an Eruv if an idol worshipper's house is considered to be a residence. There are further laws clarified by this. For instance, the concern is that this person won't want to rent out his rights in the courtyard, as this individual is worried that the Jewish person might not return his portion of the courtyard, which means it'd possibly be allowed by an informal rental, which is defined, or possibly not, as maybe he's concerned that the Jewish person wants his right to the courtyard to do something with sorcery, so he therefore won't allow it, and this is discussed further. These laws are further defined. There's now a lengthy portion on the prohibition of a student from giving legal decisions in the presence of their teacher, the explanations, opinions, and cases, and distances between the student and teacher are discussed. There's also some verses explained about Yeshua and other similar points. There's a case brought where a number of Jewish people lived by a Mavoi with one non-Jewish person who didn't want to participate in the Eruv, so they were advised to all relinquish the right to one of them, making it as if there's one Jewish person and a non-Jewish person sharing ownership of the Mavoi, and it's permissible for him to make an Eruv in that case. This was permissible as it was an unusual occurrence. This is discussed further. Some recommended just asking the guy if you could store something in his courtyard, thus making it technically legally similar to his employee, which means that you're now able to use his Eruv. This point on employees is discussed tangentially a bit. It now gets into a very long bit about how wrong it is to pray while intoxicated. There's more on this, how to get rid of intoxication and the intoxication rates of certain wines, and also not to ignore and leave food lying on the ground. But now we should leave the food, as there's a concern the food was used for sorcery, and there are sources brought. The point on not being intoxicated in prayer and verses and sources are discussed a bit longer, along with the proper time for Torah study, whether it's by night or day, focusing during prayer, and others. It also says there are 3 things that reveal a person's character: the way he drinks, the way he does business, and if he gets angry. Some say also how he laughs. Okay, back to the laws of courtyards. A case is brought if there's a courtyard with 2 parts, one with a Jew and a non-Jew, and the other outer part has just a Jewish person. It was ruled that the person who lived in just his side of the courtyard also needed to make an Eruv with the non-Jewish person too. This is argued over. They would hold the same applies if the person who lives by himself is in the inner courtyard. There's also a related incident brought. There's further points, such as how much must be leased in order to share ownership in such cases. This is discussed further, and there's an argument if you can relinquish rights from Eruvin, debates if you can relinquish rights from one courtyard to another, and there's an opinion that if you forgot to participate in an Eruv, you can relinquish your courtyard to fix this. The laws on this topic are discussed a bit further. It also says an opinion that a non-Jewish person's house, if it has an entrance of 4x4 handbreadths and opens to an empty field, even if he uses his other entrance to bring camels and wagons through to the Mavoi, it doesn't limit the others from making the Eruv without him, as we assume the entrance to the field is his main entrance, which is his exclusively. There are some similar cases discussed and further points by a Karpov lot. There's also an incident where a bris milah was being done on Shabbos and somebody accidentally spilled the hot water, which is medically needed for bathing the child, so they allowed asking a non-Jewish person to go bring it, which would only be a rabbinic issue for a Jewish person to do. Some similar cases are discussed. There's more on this topic, and also a disagreement if you can relinquish, return, and then relinquish again ownership, which is debated for a bit. It also discusses the case by the Sadducee heretic. This is spoken about along with some related situation, there's some further discussion, and it brings us to a new Mishnah. If somebody forgot to participate in an Eruv in a courtyard, but relinquished his rights, everybody can use the Eruv for their own houses, but not him or his house. If everybody else relinquished their courtyard rights to him, he can carry around, but they can't. If 2 people forgot, they're both stuck from using the courtyard, as 2 people can't relinquish and receive rights. Beis Shammai says they can only relinquish their rights before Shabbos starts, while Beis Hillel says they can do it even after. If someone relinquished their rights and then mistakenly used the courtyard anyways, it's an argument if this is considered a retraction of his relinquishment. The Gemara clarifies details on these cases. Points on relinquishing rights in a courtyard are further discussed. There are some further points. It goes over the rest and it says the argument between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, if you can relinquish your rights on Shabbos, is if you hold that it's a transfer of rights, which wouldn't be allowed on Shabbos, or an abandonment of rights, which is permissible. New Mishnah. Generally, if 3 neighbors are partners in wine ownership, that already creates an Eruv, and they don't need to make one. If you're a partner with one with wine and the other with oil, it's an argument. The Gemara clarifies an opinion that still, in this case, the wine must still be placed in one container, and it brings a source. Others disagree, saying that they could be kept in 2 containers, as wine and other wine are fit to be combined, unlike wine and oil. The opinion that allows wine and oil is where the case is a courtyard between 2 Mavoi-Alleys, and the middle courtyard can join in an Eruv with the others, even if the outer courtyard hasn't created an Eruv with each other. Or it's just like the opinion that allows for the combination of wine and oil to be considered one entity. This topic is argued further. There's also argument on the foods required when making a shittuf, whether it's bread or wine or otherwise. New Mishnah. If 5 groups were divided into 5 areas of a massive room in a large house, Beis Shammai says each group needs an Eruv. Beis Hillel says they can use one Eruv for all of them, unless they're quartered in rooms or upper stories, in which case he'd require an Eruv for each group also. The Gemara says the partitions here are makeshift dividers. If they were proper dividers 10 handbreadths tall, both opinions would require an Eruv for each group. Some say the argument is where the partitions don't reach the ceiling, and similar. These opinions are all argued on. New Mishnah. Brothers who eat in the same house of their father, but then sleep in their own homes, They both need to participate in the Eruv, or else relinquish their rights. But if the Eruv is placed in their father's house, or if they are the only residents in the courtyard, they don't need to make an Eruv. The Gemara tries to say that this shows that the place you sleep determines your residence, but perhaps not. It could be that they're not actually eating at the father's house, which is the other option. They might just be getting supported by him, so you can't bring a proof from this case. This is discussed. Some do say it's the place that you eat, some say it's the place you sleep, and we try to bring proofs. We also discuss, what if it's not a father and son? What if it's a teacher and student? It seems to imply you can, so generally this works if there's an underlying relationship and you support the individual. There's further discussion, and we try to bring more proofs to define what your residence is. New Mishnah. 5 courtyards that open to each other and also into a Mavoi. If they make an Eruv to join their courtyards, they did not make a Shittuf to combine the Mavoi. So they can walk in the courtyard, but not the Mavoi. If they created a Shittuf for the Mavoi, then they could also walk in the courtyard. If they merged both the courtyards and the Mavoi with an Eruv and the Shittuf, and one of the members of the courtyard forgot to participate, everybody else is still allowed in either one. If one of the members of the Mavoi forgot, they can use the courtyard, but not the Mavoi, as the relationship between a Mavoi to its courtyard works similarly to the relationship between a courtyard and its houses. The Gemara clarifies whose opinion this is like, and there are similar cases brought. There's further discussion and variation by Eruvin. Other cases are also brought. New Mishnah. 2 courtyards, one lined up behind the other. If the inner one joined in an Eruv and the outer one did not, you can carry in the inner one but not in the outer one. If the outer one made an Eruv and the inner one did not, you can't use either of them. If both of them made their own Eruv, they both can be used individually, but you can't cross over between them. Rabbi Akiva says that the rite of passage of the inner courtyard disallows the outer ones. The rabbis disagree. If one resident of the outer courtyard forgot to join the Eruv, the inner courtyard is allowed to be carried within, not the outer one. If a member of the inner courtyard forgot, you can't carry in either of them. If there was an Eruv placed over both courtyards and anyone forgot, both are invalidated. If one person lives in both courtyards, they don't need to make an Eruv. The Gemara clarifies both of these listed opinions. The other cases of the Mishnah are also described along with the logics of Rabbi Akiva and the sages. There's a bit more miscellaneous cases discussed and some further qualifications, and that's the end of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of Tractate Eruvin further goes through the laws of making an Eruv to combine courtyards on Shabbos. The first Mishnah states, if there are 2 adjacent courtyards that are connected by a window, at least 4 by 4 handbreadths, and within 10 handbreadths from the ground, you can make 2 separate Eruvs, or you could just make one big Eruv over both courtyards, as the window connects the 2 of them. If the window is smaller than that, or above 10 handbreadths, they both can't be combined into one Eruv. You'd need to make 2 separate ones. The Gemara tries to figure out why a small window doesn't work to connect the 2 courtyards. We try to suggest the principle of Lovewood, that such small gaps in walls are considered to be closed off. But you can instead just say that a hole that small is not considered to be significant and doesn't classify as a legal portal. There's further qualifications. It also discusses a circular window, some requiring it to have a circumference of 24 handbreadths, and a bit over the bottom 2 handbreadths should be within 10 handbreadths of the ground. The dimensions for the calculation of the circle are described. Regarding 2 houses that share a window, some say it works to combine the houses even if it's above 10 handbreadths, along with argument in regards to a portal to an attic, as to whether it requires a ladder, which should be permanent or otherwise, possibly it's discussed. New Mishnah, if the wall between the 2 courtyards is 10 handbreadths tall, and also very thick at 4 handbreadths wide, again, the courtyards can combine to make separate Eruvs, but not to be one big Eruv. If there are fruit sitting on top of the wall, members from either courtyard can climb up and eat them up there, but they can't bring them into their courtyard. If there's a breach in the wall up to 10 handbreadths, they can make 2 Eruvs, or one big one, as the breach acts as a portal. If the breach is bigger than that, they can only make one big Eruv, as there's just no longer considered to be a partition at all. The Gemara says, if the wall is less than 4 handbreadths wide, it's not considered to be a separate domain, so you wouldn't be allowed to move anything up there. Others disagree and say it's like an exempt area, meaning you would be allowed to bring food up there to eat. We try to disprove this. We also bring other cases where 2 courtyards are considered separate, where one courtyard is elevated with a wall, forming 10 handbreadths, or where there's a ditch which creates a 10 handbreadth wall. It also speaks about adjusting the wall to allow this, such as removing a section from the top of the wall, and whether you can use a utensil like an inverted basin placed by the side of the wall to reduce the height of the wall. It says that if the basin can only be removed with a hoe or similar, meaning it can't be removed on Shabbos, this is valid at reducing the height of the wall. It also discusses the effectiveness of wall reduction by certain types of ladders, and says it works by Tyrian ladders, which were very heavy and therefore unlikely to be removed. There are other similar methods of wall reduction discussed. There are other cases involving ladders and platforms extending from the wall and otherwise, along with points on extending ladders to make them wider. It also speaks about the legitimacy of carving ladder steps into a wall and other unique variants. New Mishnah. If there's a ditch between two courtyards, 10 handbreadths deep and 4 handbreadths wide, they can make their own Eruvs, but not a large one over both of them, even if the ditch is filled in with straw. If it's filled in with dirt or rocks, they can make one big Eruv, but not two small ones. If there's a board across, as long as it's over 4 handbreadths wide, that allows them to make 2 small or 1 big Eruvs. This similarly works by 2 balconies facing each other. The Gemara says that you actually could use straw to fill the ditch if you expressly verbally abandon the ditch, meaning you don't plan on removing it. There's further discussion on this, and that brings us to a new Mishnah. If 2 courtyards are divided by a 10 handbreadth tall haystack, they can make 2 separate Eruvs, but not one full one. Both sides can feed their animals from the side of their haystack. If it was lower than 10 handbreadths, they can make 1 big Eruv, but not 2 small ones. The Gemara says you can't take straw from the haystack in a basket to feed your animal, out of concern that you'll take too much and ruin the partition. So, you can't bring your animal to eat from the haystack, but you can block it from going somewhere else, so it'll turn and eat from the haystack. Some similar cases are discussed, and it says that it could be allowed to remove hay if it reaches to a roof, so that way it's noticeable if you're taking too much. There's further discussion with this haystack case. New Mishnah, now on the topic of a Shetufei Mavoi, where food is collected from each member of a courtyard and placed in one location to share ownership of a Mavoi-Alley. An easier method is brought to get a barrel of food and say that this belongs to everybody that owns part of the Mavoi, thereby granting everybody ownership of the food and expediting the whole process. It lists people who can make this transfer, yourself, certain relatives, and similar. The Gemara says that the ownership is transferred by proxy, according to one opinion, by lifting the barrel a handbreadth off the ground. There's some related topics discussed. There's a bit more on this, and if a reluctant resident can be forcibly included into such an Eruv, and we allow somebody's wife to join their household in an Eruv without the husband's consent based on a case, there's further similar discussion. There's also some miscellaneous points on the much earlier mentioned posts or beams by a Mavoi entrance, such as opinions on whether you can use wood from an Asherah tree, a tree that was worshipped for idolatry in those days, with some variation. New Mishnah. If everybody contributes their food to a shittuf, but for whatever reason the total amount decreased beneath the minimum amount required, you can just add some of your food and confer ownership of it to the other residents, and you don't even need to inform them. If more residents were added, you can add your own food, but you have to notify them. The amounts required, if there's a lot of people, you need enough food for 2 meals per person. If there are few, it's the amount of food that has the volume of a dried fig per person. This is by the creation of the Eruv. Once it takes effect, the amount of food can decrease to any amount. Also, technically, the requirement for an Eruv by a courtyard, even if they've made a shitta for a Mavoi, can be lenient, as that's only required educationally towards children. The Gemara clarifies that you can refill the food amount with a different type of food if the initial amount were only partially depleted. A lot of people is defined here as 18 people or more, few people is less than 18, and sources for this logic are brought. New Mishnah, you can use any food to make an Eruv or a shituf, besides for water and salt. Some require a whole loaf of bread as long as it's unbroken, even if it contains a massive amount of flour, or if it's very small. The Gemara says, we disallowed water and salt for these laws way earlier in the Tractate to contrast it with the other opinion that requires only bread. Others disagree, and there's argument in the necessary bread size and type. New Mishnah, you can give a small coin to a grocer or to a baker so you can share an Eruv with him. Others say you can't use money, but by non-merchants you can. This, according to one opinion, applies by Eruvei Techumin. By Eruvei Chatzeres, you can join somebody into an Eruv without their consent, as this only benefits them. The Gemara explains the logic of allowing money to be a form of acquisition based on a similar case. who we hold like by that last point is discussed, that we hold like you can make an Eruv Chatzeros for somebody. There's discussion by similar laws, by making a Nazirite oath, and otherwise. And that's the end of Chapter 7. Chapter 8 of Tractate Eruvin further discusses the laws of transferring between domains on Shabbos. The first Mishnah states, an easier way of making a communal Eruv Techum is to take a barrel of food and say that it should be owned by everybody in your town for people going to a house of mourning or to a wedding banquet. That's going to be explained in a second. Anybody who accepted to be a part of this Eruv, it works, as long as it was before Shabbos started. The Gemara clarifies this communal Eruv Techum must only be made for a matter that's for a mitzvah, hence the need for it to be for people who are traveling to a house of mourning or a wedding banquet. This is clarified and it brings some similar cases. There's some more points along with details on the institution of an Eruv by specific family members. New Mishnah, the amount of food necessary to be given for this Eruv Techum is 2 meals worth of food for each person. The amount that this is lenient. Some say it's like your weekday meals, which he holds are smaller. Others say it's like your Shabbos meals, which he holds are smaller. It also gives specific qualifications to the amount and worth of the bread being used. The Gemara further gives exact details by certain types of bread and similar. There's further definition as to specific measurements from this time period given, and how they differed from those in different regions. This goes a bit further. New Mishnah, if there is a house with residents that open up to a courtyard, and residents that open to an elevated gallery, and they don't make an Eruv, so you can't carry between them, anything 10 handbreadths above the floor is part of the gallery, and anything beneath that is part of the courtyard. Similarly, if there's a pile of dirt or a rock 10 handbreadths high, they're part of the gallery. If less, they're part of the courtyard. If it's far away, meaning 4 or more handbreadths away, it always is a part of the courtyard. The Gemara brings a number of similar specific cases where similar concepts apply. They're all discussed further. There are also unique cases with ladders and galleries brought. There are points on water pits between 2 courtyards and their laws, and some particularities by ruins. This is all discussed further. New Mishnah, if your Eruv is placed in a gatehouse, portico, or a gallery, it's not a valid Eruv, and somebody who lives in one of those does not need to participate in an Eruv. If the Eruv was placed in a straw shed, barn, woodshed, or storehouse, it is a valid Eruv, and he is required to join in a potential Eruv. Some say that if the owner of the property still owns part of these sheds, he doesn't need the guy staying there to participate in the Eruv, he can do it without him. The Gemara makes some clarifications. It says that an individual's gatehouse works to place an Eruv, and it says all these areas where you can't place an Eruv, you can place a shituf, which you obviously can't place in a Mavoi instead. This is all qualified further, discussing some related cases. New Mishnah, somebody who left his house in his courtyard to go spend Shabbos somewhere else, whether he's a Jew or a non-Jew, the people who stayed in his courtyard can't make an Eruv without him. Others disagree and say that they can. Others say only a Jewish person doesn't prevent them from making an Eruv, as a Jewish person doesn't travel on Shabbos and probably won't come back to the house. Others say that even if he's staying at a house in the same city, his daughter's house for instance, he doesn't restrict them from making the Eruv, as he's already deciding against returning home over Shabbos. The Gemara says, we hold like the last opinion, but only specifically if he went to his daughter's house and not his son's, as people often leave houses if they get into an argument with their daughter-in-law, but not with their son-in-law. New Mishnah, if there's a cistern of water between 2 courtyards, you can't draw water from it, unless there's a 10 handbreadth partition separating it. There's argument if it can be above the well, if it has to be a bit beneath the lip of the well, or if the wall has to go all the way down. The Gemara says argument if below means below the lip or actually in the water, and similar, or perhaps all the way to the bottom or similar. Points on the cistern are qualified further. This goes further for a bit. New Mishnah, if a canal passes through a courtyard, you can't draw water from it on Shabbos unless there's a 10 handbreadth tall partition set up at its entrance and exit. Others say the walls of the courtyard are a sufficient division. There's a specific instance with a canal in a certain city mentioned. The Gemara qualifies this case on drawing water from a courtyard canal on Shabbos a bit further. There's also points on the necessity of the wall of the canal. For instance, if it's very small, beneath 4 handbreadths, if the principle of Lovewood, considering small gaps to be as if they're sealed, if that applies, and similar. New Mishnah, if a balcony protrudes over a body of water, you can't draw water from it on Shabbos unless there's a 10 handbreadth high partition established either above or below the balcony. If there's 2 balconies, one above the other, if there's a partition only on the upper one, until there's an Eruv, you can't use either to draw water through the balcony. The Gemara discusses some related cases. There's more on this, and differences between pouring out sewage versus drawing in water. It also clarifies if the two vertical balconies are spaced apart. If the upper one only has the partition, then that one could draw its own water, as the lower balcony could only really reach his hole by throwing his bucket over, which is way too difficult to require an Eruv. There are some additional qualifications, such as the case discussed is where the sole partition between balconies was created in partnership with the lower one, hence the requirement for an Eruv, and if they made a partition for the lower one too, the lower balcony would say they don't want to use the upper balcony, thus making them not require an Eruv. New Mishnah. If a courtyard is smaller than 4 by 4 cubits, you can't dump wastewater in it unless there's a cesspool which can contain at least 2 se'ah, an old form of measurement of water, prior to it overflowing into a public domain. It can be inside or just outside the courtyard, but if it's just outside, it must be covered. If it's a drainage pipe running out of a courtyard for a while into a public property, the first 4 cubits going out must be covered so you can pour wastewater into it on Shabbos. Others say you can't pour directly into the pipe, no matter how far into the courtyard it reaches. You have to pour it onto a roof or something that'll then flow into the pipe. Additionally, a courtyard and portico can combine to make 4 cubits. Also, if there's 2 upper stories opposite each other with a courtyard of less than 4 cubits between them, if only one side made a cesspool between to contain their water, they can use their cesspool and the other side cannot. The Gemara says the specificity of the measurements is that a person typically uses 2 se'ah of water daily. And in an area of 4 cubits, people typically spread water to get rid of dust, so if some water runs off into a public property, it's considered unintentional and permissible. The details of this case are further discussed. It also explains the logic as to why a neighbor who didn't join in an Eruv with a cesspool can't use it, which is that it's a rabbinic ordinance. Out of concern, people will come and carry out their house utensils, which is not allowed by an unjoined courtyard, so we're safe, and we just don't allow even pouring the water. And that's the end of Chapter 8. Chapter 9 of Tractate Eruvin further discusses details on the laws of the Eruvei Chatzeros, combining courtyard ownership to be allowed to carry within its domain on Shabbos, and further similar points. The first Mishnah says all adjoined Eruvs are considered to be one domain, meaning even if the residents of the houses didn't make an Eruv, you can still carry across the Eruvs. This applies as long as there isn't a 10 handbreadth height difference between the Eruvs. Others disagree, saying each roof is a separate domain, so you can't carry between them. Some say that adjoining roofs, courtyards, or karpaf lots are considered to be one domain if the utensil being moved started Shabbos in the area, but not if it started Shabbos inside the house. The Gemara clarifies the opinion that allows carrying between these roofs. It's a safeguard against transferring an item from a public domain to another elevated public domain. This is discussed further. The opinion that doesn't allow carrying between the roofs, some say that prohibits carrying between roofs at all, more than 4 cubits at least. Others say it just prohibits carrying across the actual roofs. They argue and bring sources. There are further specifications and possible allowances on larger roofs if they have walls above that can act as side posts. There are some other unique cases brought. What if there's a permanent ladder or a second story and similar? There's also points on carrying to an adjacent roof of a portico or ruin, and the difference between the two of them, which largely goes unresolved. The points on carrying across a permissible roof area, if it means the entire roof or just an area of 4 cubits, is argued. There are some particular cases disputed based on these logics, like carrying on an upside-down ship and otherwise. There's further argument as to the designation of separate domains between roofs and courtyards and otherwise. There are some additionally unique cases brought. This is discussed further. New Mishnah, if there's a small roof next to a large roof, you can carry between them without needing an Eruv or partition. Carrying between the small roof and the house is not allowed. If a large courtyard opens into a smaller one, you can carry between the courtyards, but not from the small courtyard to its houses, as the small courtyard is just considered to be an entrance to the large one and is not an independent area. The Gemara debates the necessity for both cases. One opinion says that as the roof's wall doesn't extend upwards physically and isn't visible from the roof, we don't consider the wall to extend up at all, but both are still allowed, as the walls are both visible. As by the case of the roof doesn't extend past the walls, thus leaving the walls also visible. The opinion that says the wall is considered to extend upwards, even if the wall isn't visible from the roof, says that the case is where it's a roof that many people walk on, like the courtyard, so the walls aren't considered here to extend upwards. This and related cases are discussed. There are also related cases by a sukkah, overhanging roofs, and others brought with unique qualifications, and some cases by partitions by farmable land in a vineyard, and otherwise, such as uniquely combined 3 Karpov lots, which are ruled leniently by. There are also some points on elevated walls brought, which we discussed further. There are some additional points. New Mishnah: if a courtyard was breached into public property, you can't carry from private property to it, or vice versa. Others say you're exempt from carrying from the private or public property to this courtyard, as it's now considered a Carmelist neutral area and not a public property. The Gemara clarifies this argument and says there's an argument about the status of the location of where the actual wall was, which is said to be a public property as the public walks there, according to one opinion. New Mishnah: a courtyard breached into public property on 2 sides, or a house that was breached on 2 sides, or a mavoi where its post, crossbeam, or door frame were removed on Shabbos. Carrying in all of those is allowed for the rest of that Shabbos, but not for any future Shabbosim. Others say that what's allowed or forbidden here on this Shabbos would also be allowed or forbidden to carry on any future Shabbosim. The Gemara clarifies the case is where the breach is 10 cubits wide or less, but it's by the corner, hence being on 2 sides. The case of the house is the same, but it's an angled roof which doesn't cover and seal the breach. Others disagree and say there's a breach of over 10 cubits, and it's said on 2 sides by the case with the courtyard, as that is the case where it's by the house, which is very specific with its breaches and measurements and looks like this. Their logics are also explained. This is further discussed, and in regards to carrying in the specific breached regions listed during the rest of Shabbos, it says it's allowed for the rest of Shabbos if the breach is also a Carmelist, which is only a rabbinic issue, but it wouldn't be allowed for the rest of Shabbos if it was into a public domain, as that's a biblical issue. New Mishnah: if you build a 2nd-story house on top of and spanning across a public property above 2 other houses, or a bridge with a road underneath, you can carry beneath that on Shabbos. Others disagree. It also says an argument if you can make an Eruv for an open Mavoi with 2 walls. The Gemara questions the logic of the opinions whether the elevated house is allowed beneath, as there are 2 partitions on either side, or because the edge of the roof is viewed as if it extends downward and seals off the opening. Based on the source, it's the latter explanation. And that's the end of Chapter 9. Chapter 10, the final chapter of Tractate Eruvin, goes through some further and final laws on carrying between the 4 different types of domains on Shabbos. Again, briefly, they are the public domain, the private domain, the Carmelist, a neutral area somewhere between those 2, and the exempt area, which is basically just something that can't be either of those or a Carmelist, as it's too small, for instance, or the airspace above a public domain, which only extends 10 handbreadths into the air, unlike the others, which extend infinitely upwards. The first Mishnah states, if you're walking on Shabbos in public and see pairs of tefillin lying around, you should save them. Some say you should do this by wearing the first set, walking with them to a safe area, take them off, go back and wear the other pair. Others say to wear both pairs at once. This applies to old tefillin. You don't need to save new tefillin. If there was a bunch of tefillin tied in pairs or bundles, you need to stay with them until Shabbos ends and then bring them to safety. If it's a time of danger for the Jewish people, so you can't stay around, you should cover them and leave. Others say you should give them to another person who will hand them to another person who will hand them to another person, etc., until it reaches safety. It says you should use this method to transport a newborn baby home if it was born where you can't carry with as many people as you need. Some say you can use this human chain method to carry a barrel outside of your techum, others disagreed. The Gemara explains that the first opinion only allowed you to wear 1 pair of tefillin at a time. Sources are brought. The opinion that allows wearing 2 pairs of tefillin at once is where there's sufficient room on your head and arm to wear 2 pairs. It also briefly explains the proper placement of tefillin from the hairline to the place of a baby's fontanelle and on your bicep. The logic of the argument is further explained. Verses and similar are argued over in regards to sources. The first opinion seems to hold that this is like the opinion that you can wear tefillin on Shabbos, so it could have been said by Rabbi Akiva, who holds that, which is the topic that's debated over. Obviously, in the end, we hold that we don't wear tefillin on Shabbos. However, there are arguments and attempted proofs back and forth brought here as to whether we do or do not. There's also some side points on the usability of found types of wool or threads in regards to making tzitzis from them. It's said that only by threads is it allowed, and it's discussed. It also says the possibility that carrying new tefillin is disallowed, as its knots are untied, and you might tie them, which is not allowed on Shabbos. There's a suggestion to tie them with a bow knot, but the allowance of a bow knot on Shabbos is debated. A side point, it also says that if you purchase many pairs of tefillin from a non-expert, you need to check some of them to see if they're kosher and valid, either 2-arm and 1-head tefillin, or 2-head and 1-arm. This is discussed further. It also says that in regards to waiting with the tefillin until Shabbos ends, that's where you can't wear them pair by pair, as Shabbos would end before you finished. We said in a time of danger, you should cover them. Elsewhere it says you should carry them in 4-cubit intervals by a time of danger, but that's explained to be a danger of highwaymen versus our discussion where you can't carry them as the government outlawed tefillin. The remaining cases of the Mishnah are also qualified, like carrying the baby using a chain of people and similar. Some say the case of the barrel is pouring water from barrel to barrel. As discussed, we say the cases where it's an ownerless barrel and water, so it has no Techum-Boundary according to the first opinion, while the other ones say that it does have a boundary on Shabbos. New Mishnah, if you were reading a scroll while on a threshold and it rolls partially into a public domain, you can roll it back to yourself. If you were reading on top of a roof, private property, and it rolled off, you can roll it back up as long as it's not within 10 handbreadths of the ground. If it is, you have to leave it, but turn it so the written side is not exposed. Some say you can roll it up from any distance as long as it hasn't actually reached the ground. Others say you can even roll it up from the ground, as this is a rabbinic institution which shouldn't override respecting a scroll of scripture. There's lengthy debate in the Gemara as to what exactly the status of the threshold in this case is. Some say it's a public domain, although that's rejected from the source. There's another answer that the threshold in question is a carmelis, so there's no biblical violation if the whole scroll falls out, and there's no concern that you'll carry the scroll further from there into a private domain, as either it's a very long threshold, still you remember as you're bringing it over, or it's like the opinion that walking has the same status as standing, so the item transfer resets once you bring it into the carmelis, and from there you can bring it inside. Also, based on this, you can't throw the scriptural text. The case where the scroll unrolls off a roof, we flip it over, as this case is where there's no option to just cover it. There's argument if the case applies by a sloping wall. New Mishnah, if there's a ledge extending in front of a window 4 handbreadths wide and 10 off the ground, you can put things out or bring things in from it on Shabbos. The Gemara says the case is where the ledge extends over a public property, but it's with breakable items, so there's no concern of somebody retrieving them if they fall off. We bring sources. New Mishnah, you can stand in a private property and move things around that are in a public property or vice versa, as long as you don't move them more than 4 cubits from their original location. You cannot urinate or spit between private and public domains. Some say that if saliva collects in your mouth, walking with it in a public domain is not allowed, as at that point it's considered carrying and must be spat out. There's a lot more discussion on these topics, along with some points on the impermissibility of spitting in such a disrespectful manner in front of your teacher. New Mishnah, you may not stand in a private domain, lean forward, and drink in a public domain, or vice versa, out of concern that you'll bring the cup in. This is allowed if your head and most of your body are in the other domain where you're drinking, and this also applies by a wine press. The Gemara says this is where he needs the water, which resolves some possible disagreement. There's disagreement of drinking into a carmelis. Some say the same above laws apply, which is discussed. New Mishnah, if you're standing in a public property, if there's a rain gutter on a wall beneath 10 handbreadths, you can hold up a vessel to collect water. By a drain pipe, you can drink from it, however. The Gemara says that the gutter is less than 3 handbreadths from the roof, which has the same status as the roof itself, so you can't take water directly from it. There's further points. It also says that the drain pipe in question is less than 4 by 4 handbreadths, so it's not considered a carmelis itself. New Mishnah, if there's a water hole in a public property where its embankment is 10 handbreadths high, someone in a nearby private domain can draw water from it on Shabbos from a window above it. If there's a trash heap in a public domain 10 handbreadths high, you can pour water on it on Shabbos from a window above. The Gemara discusses precise qualifications of both of these cases, such as that the trash heap in question is public, so it's less likely to be removed, unlike a different discussed case. New Mishnah, a tree that forms a covering over the ground, if the branches don't descend to 3 handbreadths above the ground, you can carry beneath it on Shabbos. There's a general law. If the roots protrude above the ground 3 handbreadths, you can't sit on them, as then they're considered part of the tree and you can't use a tree on Shabbos. The Gemara gives many specific types and variations of roots and how they'd apply by these laws. There's further points on different types of trees and also a few things on the importance of modesty and things that women have that are worse than men as a curse from Eve's sin. things like menstruating, pain in childbirth, and similar. New Mishnah, a unique type of door to a backyard where it's not attached to the frame, it's just jammed in place, or a bundle of thorns stuffed into a doorway, or a reed mat being used as a door. You cannot close them on Shabbos unless they're suspended from the ground when they're not in use. The Gemara brings sources which say this is unlike a case with doors that have a pivot, or had one, possibly depending on your opinion. These opinions and similar are discussed. New Mishnah, no standing in a private property and picking up a key and unlocking a door in a public property out of concern that you'll accidentally bring it in. The inverse also applies unless you convert the public domain you're standing in into a private domain by setting up a partition. There are specific cases brought by a marketplace. The exact principles of the law case are debated. New Mishnah, there's an argument if you can use a bolt with a knot at its end. There's discussion by a specific case whether or not that's allowed. The Gemara says that such a bolt would be allowed if the cord tied from the door to the bolt is strong enough to lift the bolt without breaking. The argument is where it's not strong enough, whether it has the status of a utensil or not. New Mishnah, a door bolt that its cord is long enough that it drags on the ground. You can use it in the temple, where there aren't rabbinic stringencies, usually by Shabbos, but not elsewhere. If it's not attached to the door at all, it's not allowed anywhere. Others say that if it's detached, it's allowed in the temple only, and if the string causes it to drag on the ground, it's allowed everywhere. The Gemara cites some unique relevant cases. They're discussed. New Mishnah, a bottom pivot can be inserted in the temple alone, and a top pivot can't be inserted anywhere. Others say a bottom pivot is allowed anywhere, and a top pivot is only allowed in the temple. The Gemara explains that the bottom pivot is not allowed, out of concern that you'll knock it in with a hammer, which is in violation of the malacha labor on Shabbos of striking the final blow. New Mishnah, you can replace dressing on a wound in the temple, but not elsewhere. You cannot place the dressing on for the first time anywhere. The Gemara says a similar case about replacing dressing that just fell off the wound. We hold it's not allowed to be replaced. That's if it fell onto an object. Everyone agrees it's not allowed if it fell onto the floor. There's some disagreement on this. New Mishnah, you can tie an instrument broken string on Shabbos in the temple, nowhere else. You may not tie it for the first time anywhere. There's disagreement if this snapped in the middle or at the end, or possibly there's variation depending on what type of knot is allowed. New Mishnah, you can sever a wart from an animal to make it fit for a sacrifice on Shabbos in the temple, but nowhere else. That's if it's done by hand. It's not allowed anywhere with a tool. There's disagreement in the Gemara based off a later discussion. We say we're dealing with where it's a dry growth. This is debated on further. There are some additional points on the difference between the two types of growth, and in regards to permissibility of using a tool on Shabbos. New Mishnah, a Kohen whose finger got wounded, he can wrap some reed grass around it in the temple as a medicinal effect, but nowhere else. If it's to remove blood from the wound, it's not allowed anywhere. The Gemara says this only applies by a reed grass. It's not allowed by a small belt, as that constitutes an addition to the priestly garments, which is not allowed. Others disagree, as it's on your finger, where there are no priestly garments worn. The reed isn't an issue as an interposition, possibly as it's on the left hand, which isn't used for the Kohen's temple service. Possibly it's on the right hand, it's just where it's not getting in the way. These points are debated for a bit. Further, it mentions specifically reed grass as it's allowed even though it has a curative effect. New Mishnah, you can put salt on the ramp in the temple after it rained so people don't slip, and you can draw water from the temple wells, the Exiles well, and the Great Well using a windlass on Shabbos, and from the Hakir well on holidays. The Gemara says that straw, unlike salt, on the ramp is not allowed as people sometimes pick that back up. Also, the salt is where it's scattered not for a priestly service, like taking the wood for the altar up the ramp. Some say you can spread straw onto the courtyard if it was ruined by water, but they clarify it's only allowed if it's been removed from the remaining base of a broken box. There's also debate on the permissibility of making sounds on Shabbos, perhaps only musical ones, perhaps even non-musical sounds, and whether a windlass is therefore disallowed. It's debated. It also gives definition as to the different wells. New Mishnah, final Mishnah of the Tractate. If a sheret, a creeping creature that causes impurity when it's dead, is found in the temple, it's also muktzah, so it can't really be touched on Shabbos. So a Kohen should remove it with his sash so it can't cause impurity. Others say it must be removed with wooden tongs to not cause impurity even to the sash. Some say we can remove such a creature from the temple, the antechamber, and the area between the antechamber and the courtyard. Others say it can be removed anywhere that there is certain punishment for entering the area while impure. Everywhere else, you should just cover it with a copper pot until Shabbos ends and then remove it. Also, generally, if there's a rabbinic leniency here, it's technically allowed anyways, as the only reason it was disallowed by these laws is as a rabbinic stringency. The Gemara brings sources that it's not a biblical issue to bring a sheretz creature into the temple, which is debated. There are some sources discussed. Also, it mentions that the order of preference to enter the temple for tasks is Kohanim, then Leviim, then Yisraelim, and based on a verse, even an impure Kohen takes precedence over a pure Yisrael. There's disagreement if an impure Kohen or a blemished Kohen takes precedence. The point we said at the end, that the rabbinic leniency is only to override a rabbinic stringency, that refers very specifically to the point we said way earlier on page 52b, the leniency that if you get caught just outside your city's Techum after Shabbos starts, you're still allowed to enter if you're within 15 cubits of the city's Techum measurements, as those measurements are generally undervalued to be safe. The leniency by the temple was that you can tie an instrument string with a bow knot, but not a proper knot, which is a biblical issue and would require the bringing of a chatas offering. And that's the end of chapter 10 and the entire Tractate Eruvin. Alright, that was a lot of information. So here's a rough summary of a lot of the practical takeaways from this tractate. Firstly, do not carry items in a public domain on Shabbos. There are 4 classifications of domains: public domains, private domains, neutral domains, otherwise known as a carmelis, and exempt domains. You cannot carry items from a private domain to a public domain on Shabbos, or vice versa. You cannot carry an item in a public domain. There are unique qualifications by specific structures. Alleys, a mavoi, must have a post or crossbeam by one end to mark it as an entrance so you can carry within. There are additional specifications by many types of unique structures. You may not leave your Techum-Boundary on Shabbos. Do not walk further than 2,000 cubits in each direction in a square around you on Shabbos. Cities also have a Techum-Boundary, as defined by the perimeter of their city limits. A Techum can be shifted by adjusting its center with what's known as an Eruv Techumen, by leaving an amount of food in a specific location as Shabbos starts to symbolically set that as your place of residence over Shabbos. You can create types of Eruvs to join types of shared property to be allowed to carry within them. A courtyard is owned partially by all of its residents. They can make themselves all be permitted to carry within it on Shabbos by making an Eruv Chatzeros, each member leaving a specific portion of food in one of their houses, symbolically establishing a shared ownership over the courtyard and permitting everybody to carry within. This is a very similar concept by a Mavoi-Alley to establish a shared ownership and permit people to carry within, here referred to as a Shetufei Mava'os. And that's about everything. Thank you so much for watching.